protested loudly at bringing up the rear, until Cadsuane mentioned the honor of the rear guard or some such. That quieted him down. Min had no objection whatsoever to her own position with Caroline in the center of the star. She carried a knife in either hand, and wondered whether they would be any use. It was something of a relief to see the dagger in Caroline's fist tremble. At least her own hands were steady. Then again, she thought she might be too frightened to shake. The fog was cold as winter. Grayness closed around them in swirls, so heavy it was difficult to see the others clearly. Hearing was all too easy, though. Shrieks drifted through the murk, men and women crying out, horses screaming. The fog seemed to deaden sound, make it hollow, so that thankfully those awful sounds seemed distant. The mist ahead began to thicken, but fireballs immediately shot from Cadsuane's hands, sizzling through the icy gray, and the thickening erupted in one roaring flare of flame. Roars behind, light flashing against the fog like lightning against clouds, spoke of the other two sisters at work. Min had no desire to look back. What she could see was more than enough. Past trampled tents, half obscured by gray haze, they moved, past bodies and sometimes parts of bodies not nearly obscured enough. A leg, an arm, a man who was not there from the waist down. Once a woman's head that seemed to grin from where it sat on the corner of an overturned wagon. The land began to slope upward, steeper. Min saw her first living soul besides them and wished she had not. A man wearing one of the red coats staggered toward them, waving his left arm feebly. The other was gone, and wet white bone showed where half his face had been. Something that might have been words bubbled through his teeth, and he collapsed. Samitsu knelt briefly beside him, putting her fingers against the bloody ruin of his forehead. Rising, she shook her head, and they moved on. Upslope and up, until Min began wondering whether they were climbing a mountain instead of a hill. Right in front of Darlin, the fog suddenly began to take on form, a man-high shape, but all tentacles and gaping mouths full of sharp teeth. The High Lord might have been no blade master, but he was not slow either. His blade sliced through the middle of the still coalescing shape, looped and slashed it top to bottom. 4 clouds of fog, thicker than the surrounding mist, settled to the ground. "Well," he said, "at least we know steel can cut these creatures." The thicker chunks of fog oozed together, began to rise once more. Cadsuane stretched out a hand, droplets of fire falling from her fingertips. One bright flash of flame seared the solidifying fog from existence. "But no more than cut, so it seems," she murmured. Ahead to their right, a woman suddenly appeared in the swirling gray, silk skirts held high as she half ran, half fell down the slope toward them. "Thank the light!" she screamed. "Thank the light! I thought I was alone!" Right behind her, the fog drew together, a nightmare all teeth and claws looming above her. Had it been a man, Min was sure Rand would have waited. His hand rose before Cadsuane could move, and a bar of something, liquid white fire brighter than the sun, shot out over the running woman's head. The creature simply vanished. For a moment there was clear air where it had been, and along the line that the bar had burned, until the fog began closing in. A moment while the woman froze where she stood. Then, shrieking at the top of her lungs, she turned and ran from them, still down slope, fleeing what she feared more than nightmares in these mists. "You!" Toram roared, so loudly that Min spun to face him with her knives raised. He stood pointing his sword at Rand. "You are him. I was right. This is your work. You will not trap me, Althor." Suddenly he broke away at an angle, scrambling wildly up the slope. "You will not trap me." "Come back," Darlin shouted after him. "We must stick together. We must—" He trailed off, staring at Rand. "You are him. The light burned me. You are." He half moved, as if to place himself between Rand and Caroline, but at least he did not run. Calmly, Cadsuane picked her way across the slope to Rand. and slapped his face so hard his head jerked. Min's breath caught in shock. "You will not do that again," Cadsuane said. There was no heat in her voice, just iron. "Do you hear me? Not balefire. Not ever." Surprisingly, Rand only rubbed his cheek. "You were wrong, Cadsuane. He's real. I'm certain of it. I know he is." Even more surprisingly, he sounded as if he very much wanted her to believe. Min's heart went out to him. He had mentioned hearing voices. He must mean that. She raised her right hand toward him, forgetting for the moment that it held a knife, and opened her mouth to say something comforting, though she was not entirely sure she would ever be able to use that particular word innocuously again. She opened her mouth, and Padan Fain seemed to leap out of the mists behind Rand, steel gleaming in his fist. "Behind you!" Min screamed, pointing with the knife in her outstretched right hand as she threw the one in her left. Everything seemed to happen at once, half seen in wintry fog. Rand began to turn, twisting aside, and Fain also twisted, to lunge for him. For that twist, her knife missed, but Fain's dagger scored along Rand's left side. It hardly seemed to more than slice his coat, yet he screamed. He screamed, a sound to make Min's heart clench, and clutching his side, he fell against Cadsuane, catching at her to hold himself up, pulling both of them down. "Move out of my way!" one of the other sisters shouted. Samitsu, Min thought, and suddenly Min's feet jerked out from under her. She landed heavily, grunting as she hit the slope together with Caroline, who snapped a breathless, "Blood and fire!" everything at once. "Move!" Samitsu shouted again as Darlin lunged for Fain with his sword. The bony man moved with shocking speed, throwing himself down and rolling beyond Darlin's reach. Strangely, he cackled with laughter as he scampered to his feet and ran off, swallowed in the murk almost immediately. Min pushed herself out. Caroline, "I will tell you now," she said in a cold voice, her skirts violently. "I will not be treated so. I am Caroline Domodred, High Seat of House—" Min stopped listening. Cadsuane was sitting on the slope above, holding Rand's head in her lap. It had only been a cut. Fain's dagger could not have more than touched it. With a cry, Min threw herself forward. Aes Sedai or no, she pushed the woman away from Rand and cradled his head in her arms. His eyes were closed, his breathing ragged, his face felt hot. "Help him!" she screamed at Cadsuane, like an echo of the distant scream. "Help him!" A part of her said that did not make much sense after pushing her away, but his face seemed to burn her hands, to burn sense. "Samitsu, quickly," Cadsuane said, standing and rearranging her shawl. "He's beyond my talent for healing." She laid a hand on the top of Min's head. "Girl, I will hardly let the boy die when I haven't taught him much. Stop crying." It was very strange. Min was fairly sure the woman had been with power, yet she didn't. Teach him manners? A fine tussle that would be. Unfolding her arms from around his head, not without reluctance, Min backed away on her knees. Very strange. She had not even realized that she was crying, yet Cadsuane's assurance was enough to stop the flow of tears. Sniffing, she scrubbed at her cheeks with the heel of her hand as Samitsu knelt before him, placing fingertips on his forehead. Min wondered why she did not take his head in both hands the way Moiraine did. Abruptly, Rand convulsed, gasping and thrashing so hard that his failing arm knocked the yellow over on her back. As soon as her fingers left him, he subsided. Min crawled nearer. He breathed more easily, but his eyes were still closed. She touched his cheek. Cooler than it had been, but still too warm and pale. "Something is amiss," Samitsu said peevishly as she sat up. Pulling Rand's coat aside, she ripped a slice on his blood-stained shirt and a wide gap in the linen. The cut from Fain's dagger, no longer than her hand and not deep, ran right across the old round scar. Even in the dim light, Min could see that the edges of the gash looked swollen and angry, as if the wound had gone untended for days. It was no longer bleeding, but it should have been gone. That was what healing did. Wounds heal themselves up right before your eyes. This, Samitsu said in a lecturing tone, lightly touching the scar, seems like a cyst, but full of evil instead of pus. And this, she drew the finger down the gash, seems full of a different evil. Suddenly she frowned at the green standing over her, and her voice became sullen and defensive. If I had the words, Katsuane, I would use them. I have never seen the like. Never. But I will tell you this. I think if I had been one moment slower, perhaps if you had not tried first, he would be dead now. As it is, with a sigh, the yellow sister seemed to deflate, her face sagging. As it is, I believe he will die. Min shook her head, trying to say no, but could not seem to make her tongue move. She heard Caroline murmuring a prayer. The woman stood gripping one of Darlin's coat sleeves with both hands. Darlin himself frowned down at Rand as though trying to make sense of what he saw. Katsuane bent to pat Samitsu's shoulder. You are the best living, perhaps the best ever, she said quietly. No one has the healing to compare with you. With a nod, Samitsu stood, and before she was on her feet, she was all Aes Sedai serenity once more. Katsuane, scowling down at Rand with her hands on her hips, was not. Faugh! I will not allow you to die on me, boy, she growled, sounding as though it were his fault. This time, instead of touching the top of Min's head, she rapped it with a knuckle. Get to your feet, girl. You're no milksop, any fool can see that, so stop pretending. Darlin, you will carry him. Bandages must wait. This fog is not leaving us, so we had better leave it. Darlin hesitated. Maybe it was Cadsuane's peremptory frown, and maybe the hand Caroline half raised to his face, but abruptly he sheathed his sword, muttering under his breath, and hoisted Rand across his shoulders with arms and legs dangling. Min took up the heron-mark blade and carefully slid it into the scabbard hanging from Rand's waist. He will need it, she told Darlin, and after a moment he nodded. A lucky thing for him he did. She had bundled all her confidence into the green sister, and she was not about to let anyone think differently. Now be careful, Darlin, Caroline said in that throaty voice once Cadsuane made their marching order clear. Be sure to stay behind me, and I will protect you. Darlin laughed till he wheezed, and was still chuckling when they began climbing through the cold fog and the distant shrieks once more, with him carrying Rand in the center, and the women in a circle around him. Min knew she was only another pair of eyes, just like Caroline on the other side of Cadsuane, and she knew the knife she carried unsheathed was no use against the mist shapes, but Padan Fain might still be alive out there. She would not miss again. Caroline carried her dagger too, and by the looks she cast over her shoulder at Darlin, staggering uphill under Rand's weight, maybe she also intended to protect the dragon reborn. And then again, maybe it was not him. A woman could forgive any amount of no's for that laugh. Shapes still formed in the mist and died by fire, and once a huge something tore a shrieking horse in two off to their right before any Aes Sedai could slay it. Min was quite noisily sick after that, and not a bit ashamed. People were dying, but at least the people had come here by their own choice. The meanest soldier could have run away yesterday had he chosen, but not that horse. Shapes formed and died, and people died, screaming always in the distance it seemed, though they still stumbled past torn carrion that had been human an hour gone. Min began to wonder whether they would ever see daylight again. With shocking suddenness and no warning, she stumbled into it, one moment surrounded by gray, the next with the sun burning golden high overhead in a blue sky, all so bright she had to shade her eyes. And there, perhaps 5 miles across all but treeless hills, Cairn rose solid and square on its own prominences. Somehow it did not look quite real anymore. Staring back at the edge of the fog, she shivered. It was an edge, a billowing wall, stretching through the trees on this hilltop, and far too straight, with no eddies or thinning. Just clear air here and there, thick gray. A little more of a tree right in front of her became visible, and she realized the mist was creeping back, perhaps being burned off by the sun, but far too slowly to make the retreat natural. The others stared at it just as hard as she, even the Aes Sedai. 20 paces off to their left, a man suddenly scrambled into the clear air on all fours. The front of his head was shaved, and by the battered black breastplate he wore, he was a common soldier. Staring about wildly, he did not appear to see them, and went scrambling on down the hillside, still on hands and knees. Farther to the right, 2 men and a woman appeared, all running. She had stripes of color across the front of her dress, but how many was hard to say, since she had gathered her skirts as high as she could to run faster, and she matched the men stride for stride. None of them looked to either side, only launched themselves down the hill, falling, tumbling, and coming back to their feet, running again. Caroline studied the slim blade of her dagger for a moment, then thrust it hard into its sheath. So vanishes my army, she sighed. Darlin, with Rand still unconscious across his shoulders, looked at her. There is an army in Tyr if you call. She glanced at Rand, hanging like a sack. Perhaps, she said. Darlin turned his head toward Rand's face with a troubled frown. Cadsuane was all practicality. The road lies that way, she said, pointing west. It will be faster than walking cross-country, an easy stroll. Easy was not what men would have called it. The air seemed twice as hot after the fog's cold. Sweat rolled out of her and seemed to drain her strength. Her legs wobbled. She tripped over exposed roots and fell flat on her face. She tripped over rocks and fell. She tripped over her own heeled boots and fell. Once her feet just went out from under, and she slid a good 40 paces down the hillside on the seat of her breeches, arms flailing until she managed to snag a sapling. Caroline went sprawling as many times, and maybe more. Dresses were not made for this sort of travel, and before long, after a tumble head over heels ended with her skirts around her ears, she was asking Min the name of the seamstress who made her coat and breeches. Darlin did not fall. Oh, he stumbled and tripped and skidded every bit as much as they, but whenever he started to fall, something seemed to catch him, to steady him on his feet. In the beginning, he glared at the Aes Sedai, all proud tyrant high lord who would carry Rand out without any help. Cadsuane and the others affected not to see. They never fell. They simply walked along, chatting quietly among themselves, and caught Darlin before he could. By the time they reached the road, he looked both grateful and hunted. Standing in the middle of the broad road of hard-packed earth in sight of the river, Cadsuane flung up a hand to stop the first conveyance that appeared, a rickety wagon drawn by 2 moth-eaten mules and driven by a skinny farmer in a patched coat who hauled on his reins with alacrity.
Hey,
What did
Christopher,
the
how you
toothless
doing?
fellow think he had run
Good to
into?
see you.
3 ageless Aes Sedai, complete with shawls, who might have stepped down from a coach a moment before.
Salut Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien. C'est bon de te voir.
Coach a moment before. A sweat-soaked Kyrianan woman of high rank by the stripes on her dress, or maybe a beggar who had clothed herself from a noblewoman's rag closet by the state of that dress. An obvious Tyran nobleman, with sweat dripping from his nose and pointed beard, and carrying another man across his shoulders like a sack of grain. And herself. Both knees out of her breeches, and another tear in the seat that her coat covered, thank the light, though one sleeve hung by a few threads. More stains and dust than she wanted to think about. Not waiting for anyone else, she drew a knife from her sleeve, popping most of those few threads, and gave it a flourish the way Tom Marilyn had taught her, hilt snaking through her fingers so the blade flashed in the sun. "We require a ride to the Sun Palace," she announced, and Rand himself could not have done better. There were times when being peremptory saved argument. "Child," Cadsuane said chidingly, "I'm sure Kiruna and her friends would do everything they could, but there isn't a yellow among them. Samitsu and Corel really are 2 of the best ever. Lady Arillan has very kindly lent us her palace in the city, so we will take him." "No." Min had no idea where she found the courage to say that word to this woman, except It was Rand they were talking about. If he wakes, she stopped to swallow. He won't wake. If he wakes in a strange place, surrounded by strange Aes Sedai again, I can't imagine what he might do. You don't want to imagine it. For a long moment she met that cruel gaze, and then the Aes Sedai nodded. The Sun Palace, Cadsuane told the farmer, and as fast as you make these flea bags move. Of course, it was not quite so simple, even for Aes Sedai. Under Toll had a wagon load of scraggly turnips he intended to sell in the city, and no intention of going anywhere near the Sun Palace, where he told them the Dragon Reborn ate people who were cooked on spits by Aiel women 10 feet tall. Not for any number of Aes Sedai would he venture within a mile of the palace. On the other hand, Cadsuane tossed him a purse that made his eyes pop when he looked inside, then told him she'd just bought his turnips and hired him and his wagon. If he did not like the notion, he could give the purse back. That, with her fists on her hips and a look on her face that said he might just eat his wagon on the spot if he tried giving the purse back. Under Toll was a reasonable man, it turned out. Samitsu and Nyanda unloaded the wagon, turnips simply flying into the air to land in a tidy pile by the roadside. By their icy expressions, this was in no way a use to which they had ever expected to put the one power. By Darlin's expression, standing there with Rand still on his shoulders, he was relieved they had not called on him to do it. Under Toll sat on the wagon seat with his jaw trying to reach his knees, fingering the purse as though wondering whether it was enough after all. Once they were settled in the wagon bed, with the straw that had been beneath the turnips all gathered to make a bed for Rand, Cadsuane faced Min across him. Master Toll was flapping his reins and finding a surprising turn of speed
Hey
in those
D man,
moves.
how you
The
doing?
wagon lurched and jounced horribly,
Why you do some
the wheels
Beetlejuice?
not only
Nice.
shaking but apparently out of round.
Yeah, I'm still working on
Wishing
mine. I've
she had
been,
kept just a little of the straw for herself,
what can I
Min
say?
was
I've been
amused
slacking.
to see Samitsu and Nyanda growing tighter in the face as they were
It's
bounced
got
up
me
and
on
down.
the
Caroline smiled
slight
at them quite
intimidated
openly, the high
side of
seat of
it.
House Damodred not
Just 'cause the
bothering to
size of
hide
it.
her pleasure that the Aes Sedai were for once riding rough. Though in truth, slight as she was, she bounced higher and came down with harder thumps than they. Darlin, holding on to the side of the wagon, appeared unaffected, however hard he was shaken. He kept frowning and looking from Caroline to Rand. Cadsuane was another who apparently did not
Oh
care
no.
whether her
Oh,
cheek
you
ruffled.
got a job
I
now too,
expect
though.
to
So
be there before nightfall, Master Toll, she called,
that counts as a good
producing more
excuse.
flapping, if no more speed. Now tell me, she said, turning to Min, exactly what happened the last time this boy woke surrounded by strange Aes Sedai? Her eyes caught Min's and held them. He wanted it kept secret if it
I'm
could
also
be, for as
playing
long as it could be.
a
But he
game.
was dying, and the only chance he
Oh, did
had that
you?
Min saw
Nice.
rested in these three women. Maybe knowing could not help. Maybe knowing could at least make them understand something of him. They put him in a box, she began. She was not sure how she went on, except that she had to, or how she kept from bursting into tears, except that she was not going to break down again when Rand needed her. But somehow she continued through the confinement and the beatings without a tremor in her voice, right to Kiruna and the rest kneeling to
Nice.
swear fealty.
That's not
Darlin
bad.
and Caroline looked stunned. Samitsu and Nyanda looked horrified, though not for the reason she would have supposed, it turned out. He stilled three sisters? Samitsu said shrilly. Suddenly she slapped a hand over her mouth and twisted around to lean over the side of the swaying wagon and retch loudly. Nyanda joined her almost before she began, the pair of them hanging there, emptying their bellies. And Cadsuane. Cadsuane touched Rand's pale face, brushed strands of hair from his forehead. Do not be afraid, boy, she said softly. They made my task harder and yours, but I will not hurt you more than I must. Men turned to ice inside. Guards at the city gates shouted at the racing wagon, but Cadsuane told Master Toll not to stop, and he flailed at his mules all the harder. People in the
You're a
streets
CO
leaped out
worker?
of the way to
That's
avoid being
crazy.
run down, and the wagon's progress left behind shouts and curses, overturned sedan chairs, and coaches run into street vendors' stalls. through the streets and up the broad ramp to the Sun Palace,
I would
where
charge some
guards
more.
in Lord Dobraine's colors
But
spilled out as though preparing to fight off hordes.
that's just me.
While Master Toll was squealing at the top of his lungs that Aes Sedai made him do it, the soldiers saw Min. Then they saw Rand. Min had thought she was in a whirlwind before, but she had been wrong. 24 men tried to reach into the wagon at once to lift Rand out, and those who managed to lay hands on him handled him as gently as a babe, 4 to either side with their arms beneath.
Oh, co-worker?
Cadsuane must have repeated 1,000
then that's
times
not
that he
too
was
bad.
not dead as they hurried into the palace and along corridors that seemed longer than Min remembered, with more Kyrianan soldiers crowding along behind. Nobles began appearing from every doorway and crossing hall, it seemed, faces bloodless, staring as Rand passed. She lost track of Caroline and Darlin, realized she could not remember seeing them since the wagon, and wishing them well, forgot them. Rand was the only thing she cared about, the only thing in the world.
And that was an empty ball.
Nandera was with the Far Dar
Maybe I clean
Ashmai,
it.
guarding the doors to Rand's rooms with their gilded rising suns. When the graying maiden saw Rand, stone-faced Aiel composure shattered. "What has happened to him?" she wailed, eyes going wide. "What has happened?" Some of the other maidens began to moan, a low, hair-raising sound like a dirge. "Be quiet!" Cadsuane roared, slapping her hands together in a thunder crack. "You, girl! He needs his bed. Hop!" Nandera hopped. Rand was stripped and in his bed in a twinkling, with Samitsu and Nyanda both hovering over him, the Kyrianan chased out, and Nandera at the door repeating Cadsuane's instructions that he was not to be disturbed by anyone. All so fast, Min felt dizzy. She hoped one day to see the confrontation between Cadsuane and the wise one Cerelia. It had to come, and it would be memorable. Yet if Cadsuane thought her instructions were really going to keep everyone out, she was mistaken. Before she had more than moved a chair, floating it on the power, to sit beside Rand's bed, Kiruna and Bera strode in like the two faces of pride, ruler of a court and ruler of her farmhouse. "What is this I hear about?" Kiruna began furiously. She saw Cadsuane. Bera saw Cadsuane. To Min's amazement, they stopped there with their mouths hanging open. "He is in good hands," Cadsuane said. "Unless one of you has suddenly found more talent for healing than I recall." "Yes, Cadsuane," they said meekly. "No, Cadsuane." Min closed her own mouth.
Excuse me.
Samitsu took an ivory-inlaid chair against the wall, spreading her dark yellow skirts, and sat with her hands folded, watching Rand's chest rise and fall beneath the sheet. Nyanda went to Rand's bookshelf and selected a book before she sat near the windows. Reading! Kiruna and Bera started to sit, then actually looked to Cadsuane and waited for her impatient nod before they sat down. "Why aren't you doing something?" Min shouted. "That is what I might ask," Amis said, walking into the room. The youthful, white-haired wise one stared at Rand for a moment, then shifted her deep brown shawl and turned to Kiruna and Bera. "You may go," she said. "And Kiruna, Cerelia wishes to see you again." Kiruna's dark face paled, but the pair of them rose and curtsied, murmuring, "Yes, Amis," even more meekly than for Cadsuane, before leaving with embarrassed glances at the green sister. "Interesting," Cadsuane said when they were gone. Her dark eyes locked with Amis's blue, and Cadsuane at least seemed to like what she saw. At any rate, she smiled. "I should like to meet this Cerelia. She is a strong woman." She seemed to emphasize the word strong. "The strongest I have ever known," Amis said simply, calmly. You would never have thought Rand lay senseless in front of her. "I do not know your healing, Aes Sedai. I trust that you have done what can be done." Her tone was flat. Min doubted how much Amis did trust. "What can be done has been," Cadsuane sighed. "All we can do now is wait." "While he dies," a man's harsh voice said, and Min jumped. Dashiva strode into the room, his plain face contorted in a scowl. "Flynn," he snapped. Neanda's book thudded to the floor from apparently nerveless fingers. She stared at the three men in black coats as she would have at the Dark One himself. Pale-faced, Samitsu muttered something that sounded like a prayer. At Dashiva's command, the grizzled Ashaman limped to the bed on the opposite side from Kadswain and began running his hands along the length of Rand's still body a foot above the sheet. Young Narishma stood frowning by the door, fingering the hilt of his sword, those big dark eyes trying to watch all three Aes Sedai at once. The Aes Sedai and Amis. He did not look afraid, just a man confidently waiting for those women to show themselves his enemies. Unlike the Aes Sedai, Amis ignored the Ashaman, except for Flynn. Her eyes followed him, smooth face, utterly expressionless, but her thumb ran along the haft of her belt knife in a very expressive manner. "What are you doing?" Samitsu demanded, leaping up from her chair. Whatever her unease about Ashaman, concern for her unconscious patient had overcome it. "You, Flynn, or whoever you are." She started toward the bed, and Narishma flowed to block her. Frowning, she tried to go around, and he put a hand on her arm. "Another boy with no manners," Kadswain murmured. Of the three sisters, only she displayed no alarm whatsoever at the Ashaman. Instead, she studied them over steepled fingers. Narishma flushed at her comment and removed his hand, but when Samitsu tried to go around him again, he once more stepped in front of her. She settled for glaring past his shoulder. "You, Flynn, what are you doing? I won't have you killing him with your ignorance. Do you hear me?" Min practically danced from foot to foot. She did not think an Ashaman would kill Rand, not on purpose, but he trusted them, but Light, even Amis did not seem sure, frowning from Flynn to Rand. Flynn stripped the sheet down to Rand's waist, exposing the wound. The gash looked neither better nor worse than she remembered, a gaping, angry, bloodless wound slicing across the round scar. He appeared to be sleeping. "He can't do any worse than Rand already is," Min said. Nobody paid her any mind. Dashiva made a guttural sound, and Flynn looked at him. "You see something, Ashaman?" "I have no talent for healing," Dashiva said, twisting his mouth wryly. "You're the one who took my suggestion and learned." "What suggestion?" Samitsu demanded. "I insist that you be quiet, Samitsu," Kadswain said. She seemed to be the only one in the room who was calm aside from Amis, and from the way the Wise One kept stroking her knife hilt, Min was not certain about her. "I think the last thing he wants to do is harm the boy." "But Kadswain," Neanda began urgently, "that man is—" "I said be quiet," the gray-haired Aes Sedai told her firmly. "I assure you," Dashiva said, managing to sound oily and harsh at the same time, "Flynn knows what he is about. Already he can do things you Aes Sedai never dreamed of." Samitsu sniffed, loudly. Kadswain merely nodded and sat back in her chair. Flynn traced his finger along the puffy gash in Rand's side and across the old scar. That did seem more tender. "These are alike, but different, as if there's two kinds of infection at work. Only it isn't infection, it's darkness. I can't think of a better word." He shrugged, eyeing Samitsu's yellow-fringed shawl as she frowned at him, but it was a considering look she gave him now. "Get on with it, Flynn," Dashiva muttered. "If he dies—" Nose wrinkled as though at a bad smell, he seemed unable to look away from Rand. His lips moved as he talked to himself, and once he made a sound, half sob, half bitter laugh, without his face changing one line. Drawing a deep breath, Flynn looked around the room at the Aes Sedai, at Amis. When he caught sight of Min, he gave a start, and his leathery face reddened. Hastily, he rearranged the sheet to cover Rand to his neck, leaving only the old wound and the new exposed. "I hope nobody minds if I talk," he said, beginning to move calloused hands above Rand's side. "Talking seems to help a mite." He squinted, focusing on the injuries, and his fingers writhed slowly. Very much as though he was weaving threads, Min realized. His tone was almost absent, only part of his mind on the words. It was healing made me go to the Black Tower, you might say. I was a soldier till I took a lance in my thigh. Couldn't grip a saddle proper after that or even walk far. That was the 15th wound I took in near 40 years in the Queen's Guards. 15 that counted anyway. It don't if you can walk or ride after. I seen a lot of friends die in them 40 years. So I went, and the Mahale taught me healing, and other things. A rough sort of healing. I was healed by an Aes Sedai once, nigh on 30 years back now, and this hurts compared to that. Works as well, though. Then one day Dashiva here, pardon, Ashaman Dashiva, says he wonders why it's all the same, no matter if a man's got a broke leg or a cold. And we got to talking, and, well, he's got no feel for it himself, but me, seems I got the knack, you might say, the talent. So I started thinking, what if I... There. Best I can do. Dashiva grunted as Flynn abruptly sat back on his heels and wiped the back of his hand across his forehead. Sweat beaded on his face, the first time Min had seen an Ashaman perspire. The slash in Rand's side was not gone, yet it seemed a little smaller, less red and angry. He still slept, but his face seemed less pale. Samitsu darted past Narishma so quickly he had no chance to intervene. "What did you do?" she demanded, laying fingers on Rand's forehead. Whatever she found with the power, her eyebrows climbed halfway to her hair, and her tone leaped from imperious to incredulous. "What did you do?" Flynn shrugged his shoulders regretfully. "Not much. I couldn't really touch what's wrong. I sort of sealed them away from him for a time, anyhow. It won't last. They're fighting each other now. Maybe they'll kill off each other while he heals himself the rest of the way." Sighing, he shook his head. "On the other hand, I can't say that they won't kill him, but I think he has a better chance than he did." Dashiva nodded self-importantly. "Yes, he has a chance now." You would have thought he had done the healing himself. To Flynn's evident surprise, Samitsu rounded the bed to help him rise. "You will tell me what you did," she said, regal tone at strong odds with the way her quick fingers straightened the old man's collar and smoothed his lapels. "If only there was some way you could show me. But you will describe it. You must. I will give you all the gold I possess, bear your child, whatever you wish, but you will tell me all that you can." Apparently not sure herself whether she was commanding or begging, she led a very bemused Flynn over by the windows. He opened his mouth more than once, but she was too busy trying to make him talk to see it. Not caring what anyone thought, Min climbed onto the bed and lay so she could tuck Rand's head under her chin and wrap her arms around him. A chance. Furtively she studied the three people gathered around the bed, Cadsuane in her chair, Amis standing opposite, Dashiva leaning against one of the square bedposts at the foot, all with unreadable auras and images dancing around them, all with their eyes intent on Rand. No doubt Amis saw some disaster for the Aiel if Rand died, and Dashiva, the only one with any expression, a dark yet worried scowl, disaster for the Ashaman. And Cadsuane, who was not only known to Bera and Kiruna, but made them jump like girls for all their oaths to Rand. Cadsuane, who would not hurt Rand any more than she had to. Cadsuane's gaze met Min's for a moment, and Min shivered. Somehow she would protect him while he could not protect himself, from Amis and Dashiva and Cadsuane. Somehow. Unconsciously she began to hum a lullaby, rocking Rand gently. Somehow.
Chapter 37. A Note from the Palace. The day after the Festival of Birds dawned to strong winds off the Sea of Storms that actually cut the heat in Ebudar. A sky without a cloud, and the red-gold dome of the sun on the horizon, gave promise that he died, though. Matt hurried down to the palace with his green coat undone and his shirt in anticipation. He did not quite jump at every sound, but he did give a start, considerably more wide-eyed than he liked whenever one of the serving women passed, swishing her petticoats and smiling at him. Every last one of them smiled. In a perfectly
Thanks, D-Man.
way. It was all he could do not to run. At the last, he slowed, easing onto the shaded walk bordering the stable yard almost on tiptoe. Between the fluted columns of the walk, yellowish reedy plants in big red pottery bowls, and vines with wide red-striped leaves dangling from metal baskets on chains.
I don't know where that
formed
one
a
came
thin
from,
screen.
but appreciate it.
Unconsciously,
Keep
he
looking
tucked his
out,
hat lower
D-Man.
to obscure his face. His hands ran along his spear, and Ashandarai
Caught me when I was taking a hit.
unthinkingly fingering the haft as if he might need to defend himself. The dice tumbled inside his head fiercely, yet that had nothing to do with his uneasiness. The source of that was Thailand. 6 closed coaches with the green anchor and sword of House Mitsubar lacquered on the doors already waited in line before the tall arched outer gates with teams hitched and liveried drivers mounted. He could see Nalisi and Yon in a yellow-striped coat on the far side of them, and Vannon sat slumped atop an upended barrel not far from the stable doors, apparently asleep. Most of the other Red Arms were squatting patiently on the stable yard flagstones. A few tossed dice in the shadow of the huge white stable.
Right? Definitely appreciate
Elaine
it, brother.
stood between Matt and the coaches, just the other side of the screen of plants. Brianna Corley was with her, and close by, 7 more of the women.
I'm just glad I have mods that are still up at this time.
Brianna was the only one not wearing the red belt of a wise one. He had half expected them not to appear this morning. They had the features of women used to ordering their own lives and others.
I don't get
Most
trolls
had at
that
least a bit of
often,
gray in
but
their hair. Yet they watched fresh-faced
every
Elaine
once
with
in a
an air of
while I will.
expectation, seemingly on their toes, as though ready to jump at her command. The whole lot caught less than half his attention, though. None of them was the woman who had him ready to jump out of his skin. Thailand made him feel, well, helpless was the only word that seemed to fit, however ridiculous it seemed. "We do not need them, Mistress Corley," Elaine said. The daughter air sounded like a woman patting a child on the head. "I've told them to remain here until we return. We will attract less attention, especially across the river, without anyone recognizably Aes Sedai." Her notion of what to wear visiting the roughest part of the city without attracting attention was a wide green hat with green-dyed plumes, a light dust cloak of green linen worked in golden scrolls hanging down her back, and a high-necked green silk riding dress with gold embroidery climbing the divided skirts and thickly emphasizing the oval that exposed half her bosom. She even wore one of those necklaces for a marriage knife. That broad band of woven gold would make every thief's hand in the Rahad itch. She carried no weapon beyond a small belt knife. But as to that, what weapon did a woman who could channel need? Of course, every one of those red belts had a curved dagger tucked beneath it. So did Rihanna's belt of plain-worked leather. Rihanna removed a large blue straw hat, frowned at it, then put it back on and retied the ribbons. Elaine's tone did not seem to be what was bothering her. She put on a diffident smile with the hat and a timid tone. "But why does Meralila Sedai think we are lying, Elaine Sedai?" "They all do," one of the red belts said breathlessly. Udari dresses in sober colors with lines and skirts sewn up on one side to expose layered petticoats, but only this one, bone lean and with more white than black in her long hair, had the olive skin and dark eyes of an Ebudari. "Saritha Sedai called me liar to my face about our numbers, about—" She cut off short at a frown and a "be quiet, Tamarla" from Rihanna. Mistress Corley might be ready to curtsy and simper for a child if the child was Aes Sedai, but she kept a tight rein on her companions. Matt frowned up at the windows overlooking the stable yard, those he could see from where he stood. Elaborate white wrought iron screens covered some, white wooden screens of intricately carved piercework others. Not likely Thailand was up there. Not likely she would appear in the stable yard.
Hell yeah,
He had
D-Man.
been very careful not to wake her getting dressed. Besides, she would not try anything here. At least, he did not think she would. Then
One
again,
second, I'll
was
be right
anything
back.
past the woman who had had a
Gotta
half
get
dozen
more
serving women
glove
seize him in the
box.
halls last night and drag him into her apartments? The bloody woman treated him like a toy. He was not going to put up with it anymore. He was not. Light, who was he trying to fool? If they did not grab this bull of the winds and get out of Abu Dar, Thailand would be pinching his bottom and calling him her little pigeon again tonight. It's your ages, Rihanna. Elaine did not exactly sound hesitant. She never did that. But her tone became very careful. It is considered rude among Aes Sedai to speak of age, but... Rihanna, apparently no Aes Sedai since the breaking has lived as long as any of you in the knitting circle claim. That was the odd name these kin gave their ruling council. In your own case, not by over 100 years. The red belts gasped, going wide-eyed. A slender brown-eyed woman with pale honey hair gave a nervous giggle and instantly covered her mouth at Rihanna's whip-quick, "Famela!" That can't be possible, Rihanna said faintly to Elaine. Surely Aes Sedai must... Good morning, Matt said, stepping past the screen of plants. The whole discussion was idiotic. Everyone knew Aes Sedai lived longer than anybody else. Instead of wasting time, they should be on their way to the Rahad. Where are Tom and Julian? And Nynaeve? She had to have come back last night, or Elaine would have swiveted. Blood and ashes. I don't see Brigitte either. We need to be on our way, Elaine, not standing around. Is Avienda coming? She frowned at him slightly, with just a flicker of her eyes toward Rihanna, and he knew she was deciding what performance to give him. Wide-eyed innocence might damage her standing with these women as much as flashing her dimple at him would. Elaine always expected that dimple to work where all else failed. Her chin rose slightly. Tom and Julian are helping Avienda and Brigitte watch Cardin's palace, Matt. It was to be the daughter heir in near full bloom. Not the whole flowering, since she surely knew how he would react to that, but a voice full of certainty, cool blue eyes demanding, and that pretty face chill, if not exactly frozen with arrogance.
Nice and
Was
clean.
there any woman in the world who was just one person? Nynaeve will be down shortly, I'm sure. There is no reason for you to come, you know, Matt. Elysian and your soldiers are a more than adequate bodyguard. You could enjoy yourself right here in the palace until we return. Corridon, he cried. Elaine, we aren't staying in Abu Dar to settle Jacob Corridon. We are getting the bull. Then you or Nynaeve is going to make a gateway, and we are leaving. Is that clear? And I am going with you to the Rahad. Enjoy himself. The Light only knew what Tynan would get up to if he remained in the palace all day. The very thought made him want to laugh hysterically. Icy stares stabbed at him from the wise woman. Stout Sumeko pursed her lips angrily, and Melora, a plump Damani in her middle years, whose bosom he had enjoyed eyeing yesterday, planted fists on hips with a face like a thunderhead. They should have known from yesterday that he was not intimidated by Aes Sedai, yet even Rihanna gave him such a scowl he half thought she might try to box his ears. Apparently, if they were going to fall all over themselves around Aes Sedai, then everybody else had to as well. Elaine struggled with herself visibly, her lips compressed, but one thing he had to give her. She was too smart to go on with what obviously would not work. On the other hand, she was snooty to the bone, however she tried. And the other women were watching. Matt, you know we cannot leave until we have used the bowl. That haughty chin remained high, and her tone was at best halfway between explaining and telling. It might require days for us to be sure of how to use it, perhaps even half a week or more. And we might as well finish Corridon, if we can in that time. Such a crackle entered her voice on the White Cloak's name that you might have thought she bore the man a personal grudge. But something else leaped out and clamped a fist on his thoughts. Half a week! Feeling strangled, he put a finger behind the scarf knotted around his neck and tugged to ease it. Talon had used that length of black silk to tie his hands last night before he knew what she was doing. Half a week? Or more? Despite his best efforts, his voice became a touch frantic. Elaine, surely you can use the bowl anywhere. It doesn't have to be here. Egwene must want you back as soon as possible. She can use a friend or two, I'll wager. By the last he had seen, she could use a few hundred. Maybe once he got these women back, Egwene would be ready to give up that nonsense about being Amerlin and let him take her to Rand along with Elaine and Nynaeve and Avienda. And what about Rand, Elaine? Caemlyn? The Lion Throne? Blood and Ashes, you know you want to reach Caemlyn quick as you can so Rand can give you the Lion Throne. For some reason, her face grew darker almost by the word, and her eyes flashed. He would have said she was indignant, except, of course, that she had no cause. She opened her mouth angrily to argue as soon as he finished, and he set himself, ready to list her promises and to the pit of doom with what that did to her in the eyes of Rihanna and the rest. By their faces, they would have snubbed him short already in her place. Before anyone could say anything, though, a round graying woman in House Mitsubar livery was curtsying, first to Elaine, then to the women wearing red belts, and finally to him. Queen Tylin sends this master coffin, Laren said, holding out a basket with a striped cloth over the contents and small red flowers woven around the handle. You did not breakfast, and you must maintain your strength. Matt's cheeks warmed. The woman merely looked at him, but she had seen considerably more of him than when she first showed him into Tylen's presence. Considerably more. She had brought supper on a tray last night, while he tried to hide under the silk bedsheet. He did not understand it. These women had him jumping about and blushing like a girl. He just could not understand. Are you sure you wouldn't rather remain here? Elaine asked. I'm sure Tylin would enjoy your company for breakfast. The Queen said she finds you wonderfully entertaining and courteously compliant, she added in a doubtful tone. Matt fled for the coaches with the basket in one hand and his Ashandarai in the other. Are all northern men so shy? Laren said. He risked a glance over his shoulder without stopping, and heaved a sigh of relief. The serving woman was already gathering her
nice
skirts,
3.5
turning to walk
grammar.
through the screen of plants, and Elaine was motioning Rihanna and the wise women into a circle close around her. Even so, he shivered. Women were going to be the death of him yet. Rounding the nearest coach, he nearly dropped the basket at the side of Veslin, seated on the coach step, sunlight gleaming along the narrow blade of his sword as he examined the edge. What are you doing here? Matt exclaimed. Veslin slid the sword into its sheath, a grin splitting his face. Coming with you to the Rahad. I suspect you'll find more fun for us. There had better be some fun, Elysian yawned into his hand. I didn't get very much sleep last night, and now you drag me off when there are sea folk women about. Bannon sat up on his barrel, looked around, found nothing moving, and settled himself back again with his eyes shut. There'll be no fun if I can help it, Matt muttered. Elysian had not gotten much sleep? Ha! The whole lot of them had been out enjoying themselves at the festival. Not that he had not enjoyed himself in patches, but only when he could forget he was with a woman who thought he was some sort of bloody doll. What sea folk women? When Nynaeve said I returned last night, she brought a dozen or more, Matt. Veslin blew out his breath, and his hands made swaying motions. The way they move, Matt. Matt shook his head. He was not thinking clearly. Tylin was scrambling his brains. Nynaeve and Elaine had told him about the Windfinders, reluctantly and in sworn secrecy, after trying to hold back even when Nynaeve wanted to go, much less why. And not a single blush at the effort either. Women keep promises in their own way, so the saying went. Come to think of it, Lawton and Belvin were not with the rest of the Red Arms. Maybe Nynaeve thought to make up for the other by keeping them with her now. In their own way.
Shit, that sucks, D-man.
But if she had the Windfinders already in the palace, surely it would not take half a week to use
That
the
always
gold.
sucks when you gotta get a new one.
Please not. As if thinking of her had been a summons, Nynaeve came strolling through the screen of plants into the stable yard. Matt's jaw dropped. The tall man in a dark green coat on her arm was Lan. Or rather, she was on his, clinging to it with both hands, smiling up at him. With any other woman, Matt would have said she was moon-eyed and dreaming. But this was Nynaeve. She gave a start once she realized where she was, and took a hasty step to one side, though she still held on to Lan's hand for a moment. Her choice of dresses was no better than Elaine's.
Yeah, that's always good
All
when you
blue
don't pay
silk
that
and
much
green
for them.
embroidery, cut
Then it
low
makes
enough
it
to show
less,
a heavy gold ring that would have rattled on her two thumbs together,
I guess
dangling
less
into her
heartbreaking.
cleavage on a thin gold chain.
Because some of
The
them are
wide hat
pretty
she carried by
pricey.
its ribbons was trimmed with blue
I'd be
plumes.
upset if I broke some of
Her
mine.
dust cloak, green linen,
I
embroidered
have
in
broken
blue.
some of mine. It's been
She and Elaine made the other women
expensive
drab
pieces
by
to
comparison
replace
in their woolens.
their gifts.
In any case, whether or not she had been calf-eyes a moment before, she was all herself now, shifting her braid around. "Join the other men now, lad," she said peremptorily, "and we can go. The last 4 coaches are for the men." "As you say."
Yeah, Pyrex is
I
always the
replied,
way to go, but then
bowing with
again,
a hand on his sword hilt.
the Pyrex is
She watched him stride toward Matt
on the
with
tad
an
pricey
expression of
side on
wonder,
some of them,
probably unable to believe he was obeying
but
so
they're worth
meekly.
it because they'll take a
Then
beating.
gave herself a shake and recovered her bristly self again. Gathering up Elaine and the other women, she herded them toward the first 2 coaches like a woman shooing geese. By the way she shouted for someone to open the stable-yard gates, no one would have known she had been the one delaying their departure. She shouted at the drivers, too, setting them to snatching up their reins and flourishing their long whips. It was a marvel they waited for anyone to climb aboard. Scrambling awkwardly after Lan and Elysian and Veslin into the 3rd coach, Matt propped his spear across the door and sat down hard with the basket on his lap as the coach lurched forward. "Where did you come from, Lan?" he burst out as soon as introductions were out of the way. "You're the last man I expected to see. Where have you been? I thought you were dead. I know Rand's afraid you are. And letting Nynaeve order you around? Why in the light would you do that?" The stone-faced warder seemed to consider which question to answer. "Nynaeve and I were married last night by the mistress of the ships," he said finally.
Nice. That's when you know you got a good one.
Several
When you can drop it from that height and
marriage customs.
it's still in one
There
piece.
were surprises for both of us. A small smile touched his mouth, if nothing else. He shrugged slightly. Seemingly, that was all the answer he intended to give. "The blessing of the light be upon you and your bride," Veslin murmured politely, with as much of a bow as the confines of the coach would allow, and Elysian mumbled something, though it was plain from his expression that he thought Lan must be mad. Elysian had had a good bit of Nynaeve's company. Matt just sat there, swaying with the coach's motion and staring. Nynaeve? Married? Lan? Married to Nynaeve? The man was. No wonder his eyes looked so bleak. Matt would as soon have stuffed a rabid fox down his own shirt. Only a fool married, and only a madman would marry Nynaeve. If Lan noticed that not everyone was overjoyed, he gave no sign. Except for his eyes, he looked no different than Matt remembered. Maybe a little harder, if that was possible. "There is something more important," Lan said. "Nynaeve doesn't want you to know, Matt, but you need to hear it. Your 2 men are dead, killed by Moghedian. I'm sorry, but if it is any consolation, they truly were dead before they knew. Nynaeve thinks Moghedian must be gone, or she'd have tried again, but I am not so certain. It seems she has a personal enmity toward Nynaeve, although Nynaeve managed to avoid telling me why." Again the smile. Lan seemed unaware of it. "Not all of it, at least. And it does not matter. Best you know what might be facing us beyond the river, though." "Moghedian," Veslin breathed, eyes shining. The man was probably seeing fun. "Moghedian," Elysian breathed, but in his case, it was more of a
That was
groan,
my other one, just like
and
that.
he gave his pointed beard a fitful jerk. "Those
This
bloody
one has a little bit
flaming
more
women,"
gone from
Matt
it.
muttered. "I hope you are my wife," Lan said coldly, one hand gripping the hilt of his sword, and Matt quickly raised his own hands. "Of course not. Just Elaine and the kin." After a moment, Lan nodded, and Matt breathed a small sigh of relief. It would be just like Nynaeve to get him killed by her husband. Her husband? When sure as bread was brown, she would have hidden the fact that one of the Forsaken might be in the city. Even Mogedion did not really frighten him, not so long as he had the fox head around his neck. But the medallion could not protect Nelician or any of the rest. No doubt Nynaeve thought she and Elaine would do that. They let him bring along the red arms, all the while laughing up their sleeves at him.
After they get hand-blown pieces, they take a
Aren't you
good
going to read
fall.
my mother's note, Matt?
Because this took a pretty good
Until
fall
Vesla
from about
mentioned it,
5 feet
realized
to
there
a
was a sheet of
concrete
paper,
slab.
small, tucked in
Straight
between the
down like
basket and
that.
the striped cloth. Just enough showed to reveal the green seal impressed with the anchor and sword. He broke the wax with his thumb and unfolded the page, holding it so Veslin could not see what was written. As well he did. But then again, considering how the other man saw things, maybe it did not matter. Either way, Matt was just as glad no eyes but his saw those words. His heart sank deeper by the line. Matt, my sweet, I'm having your things moved to my apartments. So much more convenient. By the time you return, Rosella will be in your old rooms to look after young Oliver. He seems to enjoy her company.
Nice.
I have seamstresses coming to measure you.
That's always good.
You must wear shorter coats. And new breeches, of course. You have a delightful bottom. Duckling, who is this daughter of the 9 moons I made you think of? I have thought of several delicious ways to make you tell me. Thailand. The others were all looking at him expectantly. Well, Lan was simply looking, but his gaze was more unnerving than the rest. That stare seemed almost dead. The Queen thinks I need new clothes, Matt said, stuffing the note into his coat pocket. I think I'll take a nap. He pulled the brim of his hat down over his eyes, but he did not close them, staring out the window, where the tied-back curtain let in occasional eddies of dust. It also let in the wind, though, which was considerably better than the heat of a closed coach. Mogedion and Tylen. Of the two, he would rather confront Mogedion. He touched the fox head hanging in the open neck of his shirt. At least he had some protection against Mogedion. Against Tylen, he had no more than he did against the daughter of the bloody 9 moons, whoever she was. Unless he could find some way to make Nynaeve and Elaine leave Ebudar before tonight, everybody was going to know. Sullenly, he tugged his hat lower. These flaming women really were making him act like a girl. In another minute, he was afraid, he might just start crying. Chapter 38. 6 Stories. Matt would have gotten out and pulled the coach himself if he could. He thought they might have moved faster. The streets were already full, with the sun not all the way up, wagons and carts wending their way noisily through the crowds and wind-blown dust, to shouts and curses both from drivers and those forced to get out of the way. So many barges slid along the canals and the bargemen's poles that a man almost could have walked the canals like streets, stepping from one barge to the next. A noisy hum hung over the gleaming white city. Ebudar seemed to be trying to make up for time lost yesterday, not to mention at High Chazeline, and the Feast of Lights, and well it might, considering that tomorrow night was the Feast of Embers, with Madam's Day celebrating the founder of Altara 2 days after that, and the Feast of the Half Moon the following night. Southerners had a reputation for industry, but he thought it was because they had to work so hard to make up for all the festivals and feast days. The wonder was that they had the strength for it. Eventually, the coaches did reach the river, drawing up at one of the long stone landings that jutted out into the water, all lined with steps for boarding the boats tied alongside. Sticking a wedge of dark yellow cheese and a butt end of bread into his pocket, he stuffed the basket well under the seat. He was hungry, but someone in the kitchens had been in too much of a hurry. Most of the basket was filled with a clay pot full of oysters, but the kitchens had forgotten to cook them. Scrambling down behind Lan, he left Nelician and Veslin to help Vannon and the others down from the last coaches. Nearly a dozen men, and not even the Karianen really small, they had been jammed in like apples in a barrel and clambered out stiffly. Matt strode ahead of the warder toward the lead coach, the Ashandarai slanted across his shoulder. Nynaeve and Elaine were both going to get a piece of his mind, no matter who was listening. Trying to keep Mogedion hidden, not to mention 2 of his men dead. He was going to... Suddenly very conscious of Lan standing behind him like a stone statue with that sword on his hip, he amended his thoughts. The daughter heir, at least, was going to hear about keeping that sort of secret. Nynaeve was standing on the landing, tying on her blue-plumed hat and talking back up into the coach when he reached it. "We'll work out, of course, but who would think the sea folk of all people would demand such a thing? Even just in private." "But Nynaeve," Elaine said as she stepped down with her green-plumed hat in her hand, "if last night was as glorious as you say, how can you complain about—" That was when they became aware of him and Lan. Of Lan, really. Nynaeve's eyes opened wider and wider, filling her face as it reddened to shame 2 sunsets. Maybe 3. Elaine froze with 1 foot still on the coach step, giving the warder such a frown you would have thought he had sneaked up on them. Lan gazed down at Nynaeve, though, with no more expression than a fence post. And for all Nynaeve appeared ready to crawl under the coach and hide, she stared up at Lan as if no one else existed in the world. Realizing her frown was wasted there, Elaine took her foot off the step and moved out of the way of Rihanna and the 2 wise women who had shared the coach, Tamarla and a graying Saldaean woman named Janira. But the daughter heir did not give up. Oh no, she transferred that scowl to Matt Cawthon, and if it altered a whit, it was to deepen. He snorted and shook his head. Usually when a woman was in the wrong, she could find so many things to blame on the nearest man that he wound up thinking maybe he really was at fault. In his experience, old memories or new, there were only 2 times a woman admitted she was wrong: when she wanted something, and when it snowed at midsummer. Nynaeve seized at her braid, but not as if her heart was in it. Her fingers fumbled and fell away, and she started wringing her hands instead. "Lan," she began unsteadily, "you mustn't think I would talk about—" The warder cut in smoothly, bowing and offering her his arm.
This pen.
Nynaeve. Whatever
This
you say in
pen is
public, you may.
That's
May
from
I
the
escort
beast.
you to the boat? Yes, she
'Cause-
said, nodding so vigorously that her hat nearly fell off.
Okay, this is still on. Let me show you
She
the
straightened it hurriedly
differences
with
in the
both hands.
hits these boats give.
Yes, in public. You will escort me.
And I can take the
Taking
same
his
type
arm,
of drag
she
from
regained
both
some
of
measure
them.
of composure, at least insofar as her face went. Gathering her dust cloak in her free hand, she practically dragged him across the quay toward the landing. Matt
Let me
wondered
take
whether
a
she
drink
might be
before
ill.
I hit
He
this
rather
one.
enjoyed seeing Nynaeve drop to peg or 6.
You better
She
tell on
hardly ever let it
the
last 2
cloud.
breaths. Aes Sedai could not heal themselves. Maybe he should suggest to Elaine that she deal with whatever was wrong with Nynaeve. He avoided healing on death or marriage himself, but it was different for other people as he saw it. First, though, he had a few choice words to say about secrets. Opening his mouth, he raised an admonitory finger. And Elaine poked him in the chest with hers, her scowl beneath that plumed hat so cold it made his toes hurt. "Mrs. Corey," she said in the icy voice of a king, "explain to Nynaeve the significance of those red flowers on the head. Is he at least to have shame enough to have hidden?" His face went redder than Nynaeve's. A few paces away, the other 2 were tying on hats the way women did every time they stood up, sat down, or moved 3 steps. Yet, despite giving their attention to their clothes, they had enough left over for glances in his direction,
Right.
and for once, they were neither disapproving nor startled. He had not known the bloody
I'll be
flowers
right
meant
back.
anything.
Give me 1 second.
10 sunsets would not have done for his face. "So," Elaine's voice was low for his ears alone, but it dripped disgust and contempt. She gave her cloak a twitch to keep it from touching him. "It's true. I could not believe it of you, not even you. I'm sure Nynaeve couldn't. Any promise I made to you is abolished. I would not keep any promise to a man who could force his attentions on a woman, on any woman, but especially on a queen who has offered him. Me force my attentions on her," he shouted. Or rather, he tried to shout. Choking made it come out in a wheeze. Seizing Elaine's shoulders, he pulled her away from the carriages a little distance. Shirtless dockmen in stained green leather vests hurried by, carrying sacks on their shoulders or rolling barrels along the quay, some pushing low barrows loaded with crates, all giving the coaches a wide berth. The Queen of Altara might not have much power, but her sigil on a coach door ensured that commoners would give it room. Nalisian and Veslin were chatting as they led the Red Arms onto the landing, Bannon bringing up the rear and staring gloomily at the choppy river. He claimed to have a tender belly when it came to boats. The wise women from both coaches had gathered around Rihanna, watching, but they were not close enough
the
to
difference, because this is a
He whispered hoarsely,
3.5 grammer.
You listen to me. That woman won't take no for an answer. I say no, and she laughs at me. She starved me, bullied me, chased me down like a stag.
This one hits
she has more hands than any 6 women I ever met.
Way harder.
She threatened to have the serving women undress me if I didn't let her. Abruptly, what he was saying hit him, and who he was saying it to. He managed to close his mouth before he swallowed a fly. He became very interested in one of the dark metal ravens inlaid in the haft of the Ashandarai.
But the good thing is, all 3 of my pins are indicas, so
you don't understand.
It's good for me.
He muttered. You have it all backwards. He risked a glance at her under the edge of his hat.
I prefer indica over sativa.
A faint blush.
Hybrids are good, but I still rather have an indica.
As a marble bust. It appears that I may have misunderstood, she said soberly. That is very bad of Tylen. He thought her lips twitched. Have you considered practicing different smiles in a mirror, Matt? Startled, he blinked. What? I have heard reliably that is what young women do who attract the eyes of kings. Something cracked the sobriety of her. This time her lips definitely twitched. You might try better. Catching her lips with her teeth, she turned away, shoulders shaking, a dust cloak streaming behind her as she hurried toward the landing. Before she darted beyond hearing, he heard her chortle something about a taste of his own medicine. Rihanna and the woman followed in her wake, a flock of hens following a chick instead of the other way around. The few bare-chested boatmen up on their boats stopped coiling lines or whatever they were doing and bowed their heads respectfully as the procession went by. Snatching off his hat, Matt considered throwing it down and jumping on it. Women! He should have known better than to expect sympathy. He would like to throttle the bloody daughter heir, and Nynaeve too, on general principle. Except, of course, that he could not. He had made
Christopher's in
those dykes were still using his skull
different time zone than us, D-Man.
Might be around
I think for him it's already morning.
Settling the hat squarely back on his head, he marched down the landing, brushed past the wise woman, and caught up to Elaine. She was still trying to fight down giggles, but every time she cut her eyes his way, the color in her cheeks renewed itself, and so did the giggles. He stared straight ahead. Bloody women. Bloody promises. Removing his hat long enough to pull the leather cord from around his neck, he reluctantly shoved it in her direction.
I know, Snoopy.
The silver fox head dangled beneath his fist. You and Nynaeve will have to decide which of you wears this. But I want it back when we leave Abu Dar. You understand? The moment we leave... Suddenly he realized he was walking alone. Turning, he found Elaine standing stock still 2 paces back, staring at him with Rihanna and the rest clustered behind her. What's the matter now? He demanded. Oh, yes. I know all about Maggedian. A skinny fellow with red stones on his brass hoop earrings bending over a mooring line jerked around so fast at that name that he pitched over the side with a loud yell and a louder splash. Matt did not care who heard. Trying to keep her secret.
This one here is the old man.
You promised. Well,
buddy.
That later. I made a promise too.
Come on, let's come this way. There we go.
You alive. Maggedian shows up, she'll go after you too. Now here. He pushed the medallion at her again.
He'll be 16 years old next month.
Only after the older women were on their way over, Nynaeve stood beckoning them at the head of a flight.
Got my other boy over there.
Did Elaine take the fox head, turning it over in her fingers? Do you have any notion?
Put this back up.
She said quietly. Any notion at all? She was tall for a woman, but she still had to look up at him. She might never have seen him before. You are a troublesome man, Nat Colton. Lenny would say I was repeating myself, but you... Expelling her breath, Elaine reached up to pull his hat off and slipped the cord over his head. She actually tucked the fox head into his shirt and patted it before handing him his hat. I won't wear that while Nynaeve still doesn't have one, or Avienda. and I think they feel the same. You wear it. After all, you can hardly keep your promise if Mogedion kills you. Not that I think she's still here. I think she believes she killed Nynaeve, and I would not be surprised if that was all she came for. You must be careful. Nynaeve says there's a storm coming, and she doesn't mean this wind. That faint blush returned to her cheeks. I am sorry I laughed at you. She cleared her throat, looking away. Sometimes I forget my duty to my subjects. You are a worthy subject, Madam Coffin. I will see that Nynaeve understands the right of you and Tylen. Perhaps we can help. No, he spluttered. I mean, yes. I mean, that is... Oh, kiss a flaming goat if I know what I mean. I almost wish you didn't know the truth. Nynaeve and Elaine sitting down to discuss him with Tylen over tea. Would he ever live that down? Would he ever again look any of them in the eye afterward? But if they did not, he was between the wolf and the bear with nowhere to run. Oh, sheep swallop! Sheep swallop and bloody buttered onions! He nearly wished she would call him down for his language the way Nynaeve would, just to change the subject. Her lips moved silently, and for an instant he had the strange impression that she was repeating what he had just said. Of course not. He was seeing things, that was all. Aloud, she said, I understand, sounding just as if she did. Come along now, Matt. We can't waste time standing in one spot. Gaping, he watched her lift skirts and cloak to make her way along the landing. She understood. She understood, and not one acid little comment, not one cutting remark. And he was her subject, her worthy subject. Fingering the medallion, he followed. He had been sure the fight would be to ever get it back. If he lived as long as two Aes Sedai, he still would never understand women, and noble women were purely the worst. When he reached the steps Elaine had gone down, the boat's two brass-earringed oarsmen were already using their long sweeps to push the vessel away. Elaine was herding Rihanna and the last of the wise women into the cabin, and Lan stood up in the bows with Nynaeve. A shout from Veslin called him onto the next boat, which held all of the men except the warder. Nynaeve said there wasn't any room for any of us, Nelisian said as the boat rocked its way out into the Elder. She said we'd crowd them. Veslin laughed, looking around their own boat. Vannon sat beside the cabin door with his eyes closed, trying to pretend he was somewhere else. Arnon and Tad Candle, and Endoran, despite being as dark as either of the boatmen, had climbed atop the cabin. The rest of the Red Arms hunkered about the deck, trying to keep out of the way of the rowers. Nobody went into the cabin, all apparently waiting to see whether Matt and Elysian and Veslin wanted it. Matt put himself beside the tall bow post, peering after the other boat, crawling on its sweeps just ahead. The wind whipped the dark, choppy waters, and his scarf as well, and he had to hold on to his hat. What was Nynaeve up to? The other 9 women on the second boat were all in the cabin, leaving the deck to her and Lan. They stood up in the bows, Lan with his arms folded, Nynaeve gesturing as though explaining. Except that Nynaeve seldom explained anything. Better say never than seldom. Whatever she was doing, it did not last long. There were whitecaps out in the bay, where seafolk rakers and skimmers and soarers heaved at their anchors. The river was not so bad, but the boat still wallowed more than Matt remembered from any previous trip. Before long, Nynaeve was draped over the railing, losing her breakfast while Lan held her. That reminded Matt of his own belly. Tucking his hat under his arm so it could not blow away, he pulled out the wedge of cheese. When is this storm likely to break before we come back from the Rahab? He took a bite of the sharp-tasting cheese. They had 50 different sorts in Abu Dar, all good. Nynaeve was still hanging over the side. How much had the woman eaten this morning? I don't know where we'll shelter if we're caught. He could not think of a single inn he had seen in the Rahad that he would take the women into. No storm, Veslin said, seating himself on the railing. These are the winter trade winds. The trades come twice a year, in late winter and late summer. But they have to blow much harder before it comes to storm. He directed a sour look out toward the bay. Every year those winds brought ships from Tarabon and Aradaman. I wonder whether they ever will again. The wheel weaves, Matt began, and choked on a crumb of cheese. Blood and ashes, he was starting to sound like some gray hair resting his aching joints in front of the fireplace. Worrying about taking the women into a rough inn? A year ago, half a year, he would have taken them and laughed when their eyes popped, laughed at every prim sniff. Well, maybe we'll find you some fun in the Rahat anyway. At the least, somebody will try to cut a purse or pull Elaine's necklace off. Maybe that was what he needed to clean the taste of sobriety from his tongue. Sobriety? Light. What a word to apply to Matt Coffin. Coffin must be scaring him more than he thought if he was shriveling up this way. Maybe he needed some of Beslin's sort of fun. That was crazy. He had never seen the fight he would not rather walk around. But maybe... Beslin shook his head. If anyone can find it, you can, but we'll be with 7 wise women, Matt. 7. With just 1 at your side, you could slap a man, even in the Rahat, and he would swallow his tongue and walk away. And the women. What's the fun of kissing a woman without the risk she'll decide to stick a knife in you? Burn my soul, the Lycian muttered into his beard. It sounds as though I've dragged myself from bed for a dull morning. Beslin nodded in commiseration. If we're lucky, though, the Civil Guard does send patrols to the Rahat occasionally, and if they're after smugglers, they dress like anyone else. They seem to think nobody will notice a dozen or so men together carrying swords, whatever they wear, and they're always surprised when the smugglers ambush them, which is what nearly always happens. If Matt's Taviran luck works for us, we might be taken for the Civil Guard, and some smugglers might attack us before they see the red belts. Elysium brightened and began rubbing his hands together. Matt glared at them. Maybe Beslin's sort of fun was not what he needed. For one thing, he had more than enough of women with knives. Nynaeve still hung over the side of the boat ahead. That would teach you to gorge yourself. Wolfing down the last of the cheese, he began on the bread and tried to ignore the dice in his head. An easy trip with no trouble did not sound bad at all. A quick trip with a quick departure from Abu Dar. The Rahat was everything he remembered, and everything Beslin feared. The wind made climbing the cracked gray stone steps at the boat landing into a perilous feat, and after that it grew worse. Canals ran everywhere, just as across the river, but here the bridges were plain, the grimy stone parapets broken and crumbling. Half the canals were so silted that boys waded waist-deep in them, and hardly a barge was to be seen. Tall buildings stood crowded together, blocky structures with scabrous once-white plaster gone in huge patches to reveal rotting red brick, bordering narrow streets with broken paving stones. In those streets where even the fragments had not been ripped up. Morning did not really reach into the shadows of the buildings. Dingy laundry hung drying from every third window, except where a structure stood empty. Some did, and those windows gaped like eye sockets in a skull. A sour, sweet smell of decay permeated the air, last month's chamber pots and ancient refuse moldering wherever it had been flung, and for every fly on the other side of the Eldar, 100 buzzed here in clouds of green and blue. He spotted the peeling blue door of the Golden Crown of Heaven, and shuddered at the thought of taking the women in there if the storm broke, despite what Beslin said. Then he shuddered again for having shuddered. Something was happening to him, and he did not like it. Nynaeve and Elaine insisted on taking the lead, with Rihanna between them and the wise women close behind. Lan stayed at Nynaeve's shoulder like a wolfhound, hand on sword hilt, eyes constantly searching, radiating menace. In truth, he was probably enough protection for 24 pretty 16-year-olds carrying sacks of gold, even here. But Matt insisted that Bannon and the rest keep their eyes open. In fact, the former horse thief and poacher kept so close to Elaine that anyone could have been forgiven for thinking he was her warder, if a rather fat and rumpled one. Beslin rolled his eyes expressively at Matt's instructions, and Elysian irritably stroked his beard and muttered that he could still be in bed. Men strutted arrogantly along the streets, with often ragged vests and no shirts, wearing great brass hoops in their ears and brass finger rings set with colored glass. One knife or sometimes two stuck behind their belts. Hands hovering near those knives, they stared as though daring someone to give the wrong twist to a look. Others skulked from corner to corner, doorway to doorway, with hooded eyes, imitating the slat-ribbed dogs that sometimes snarled from a dark alleyway, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze into. Those men hunched over their knives, and there was no way to tell which would run and which stab. By and large, the women made any of the men appear humble, parading in worn dresses and twice as much brass jewelry as the men. They carried knives too, of course, and their bold, dark eyes sent 10 sorts of challenge in every glance. In short, the Rahad was the sort of place where anyone wearing silk could hardly hope to walk 10 steps without being cracked over the head, after which they had best hope to wake stripped to the skin and tossed onto a pile of rubbish in an alley, since the alternative was not to wake at all. But children darted from every second door with chipped pottery cups of water sent by their mothers in case the wise women wished to drink. Men with scarred faces and murder etched into their eyes stared open-mouthed at 7 wise women together, then bobbed jerky bows and inquired politely if they could be of assistance. Was there anything that required carrying? Women, sometimes with as many scars,
doing
and
well
always
out there
eyes
tonight.
tightly
Stay
clenched,
safe. Or
curtsied
morning,
awkwardly
depending
and
where y'all
breathlessly
at.
asked whether they might supply directions. Had anyone made a bother of themselves to bring so many wise women? If so, the strong implication was, Tamala and the rest had no need of troubling themselves if they would just supply the name. Oh, they glared at the soldiers as hotly as ever, though even the hardest flinched away from Lan after a single look, and oddly enough from Vannon. A few of the men growled at Veslin and Elysian whenever they gazed too long at a woman's deep neckline. Some growled at Matt, though he could not understand why. Unlike those two, he was never in danger of his eyeballs falling down the front of a woman's dress. He knew how to look discreetly. Nynaeve and Elaine were ignored for all their finery, and so was Rihanna in her red wool dress. They did not have the red belt, but they did have the protection of those belts. Matt realized that Veslin had been right. He could empty his purse on the ground, and no one would pick up a copper, at least so long as the wise women remained. He could pinch the bottom of every woman in sight, and even if she had apoplexy, she would walk away. "What a pleasant walk," Elysian said dryly, "with such interesting sights and smells. Did I tell you I didn't get much sleep last night, Matt?" "Do you want to die in bed?" Matt grumbled. They might as well all have stayed in bed. They were bloody useless here, that was for sure. The tyrant snorted indignantly. Veslin laughed, but he probably thought Matt meant something else. Across the Rahad they marched, until Rihanna finally stopped in front of a building exactly like every other, all flaking plaster and crumbling brick, the same Matt had followed another woman to yesterday. No laundry hung from these windows, only rats lived in there. "In here," she said. Elaine's eyes climbed slowly to the flat roof. 6, she murmured in tones of great satisfaction. 6, Nynaeve sighed, and Elaine patted her arm as though sympathizing with her. "I wasn't really sure," she said. So Nynaeve smiled and patted her. Matt did not understand a word of it. So the building had 6 floors. Women behaved very strangely sometimes. Well, most of the time. Inside, a long hallway carpeted with dust ran dimly to the back, the far end lost in shadows. Few of the doorways held doors, and those were rough planks. One opening, almost a third of the way down the hall, led to a narrow flight of steep stone-faced steps climbing upward. That was the way he had gone the day before, following footprints in the dust, but he thought some of those other openings must be crossing corridors. He had not taken time to look around then, but the building was too deep and too wide for this floor to be served by only the one they saw. It was too big for only one way in. "Really, Matt," Nynaeve said, when he told off Harnan and half the Red Arms to find any way back in and guard it. Lan kept so close to her side he might have been glued there. "Don't you see by now there's no need?" Her tone was so mild that Elaine must have passed on the truth about Tylan, but if anything, that only soured his mood further. He did not want anyone to know. Bloody useless. But those dice were still rattling around in his head. Maybe Mogedion likes back doors, he said dryly. Something chittered in the dark end of the hall, and one of the men with Harnan cursed loudly about rats. You told him, Nynaeve breathed furiously at Lan, one hand snapping shut on her braid. Elaine made an exasperated sound. This is no time to stop for an argument, Nynaeve. The bowl is upstairs. The bowl of the winds. A small ball of light suddenly appeared, floating in front of her, and without waiting to see whether or not Nynaeve was coming, she gathered her skirts and darted up the stairs. Vannon dashed after her with a startling turn of speed for his bulk, followed by Rihanna and most of the wise women. Round-faced Tsumeko and Iaina, tall and dark and pretty despite the lines at the corners of her eyes, hesitated, then remained with Nynaeve. Matt would have gone too, if Nynaeve and Lan had not been in his way. Would you let me by Nynaeve? He asked. He deserved to be there at least, when this fabulous bloody bull was uncovered. Nynaeve? She was so focused on Lan she seemed to have forgotten anyone else. Matt exchanged glances with Beslin, who grinned and squatted easily, with Korovin and the remaining Red Arms. Nelisian leaned against the wall and yawned ostentatiously, which was a mistake with all that dust about. The yawn turned into a coughing fit that darkened his face and doubled him over. Even that did not distract Nynaeve. Carefully, she took her hand away from her braid. I am not angry, Lan, she said. Yes, you are, he replied calmly, but he had to be told. Nynaeve, Matt said. Lan? Neither one of them so much as flickered an eye his way. I would have told him when I was ready, Landman Dragoran. Her mouth clamped shut, but her lips writhed as though she were talking to herself. I will not be angry with you, she went on in a much milder tone, and that sounded addressed to herself as well. Very deliberately, she tossed her braid back over her shoulder, jerked that blue-plumed hat straight, and clasped her hands at her waist. If you say so, Lan said mildly. Nynaeve quivered. Don't you take that tone with me, she shouted. I tell you I'm not angry. Do you hear me? Blood and ashes, Nynaeve, Matt growled. He doesn't think you're angry. I don't think you're angry. A good thing women had taught him to lie with a straight face. Now can we go upstairs and fetch this bloody bull of the winds? A marvelous idea, said a woman's voice from the door to the street. Shall we go up together and surprise Elaine? Matt had never seen the two women who walked into the hall before, but their faces were Aes Sedai faces. The speaker's was long and cold as her voice, her companions, framed by scores of thin dark braids, worked with colored beads. Nearly 24 men crowded in behind them, bulky fellows with heavy shoulders, clubs and knives in hand. Matt shifted his grip on the Akandara. He knew the foxhead on his chest was cool, almost cold against his skin. Somebody was holding the one power. The two wise women nearly fell over, dropping curtsies as soon as they saw those ageless faces, but Nynaeve certainly knew trouble too. Her mouth worked soundlessly as the pair came down the hallway, her face all consternation and self-recrimination. Behind him, Matt heard a sword leaving its scabbard, but he was not about to look back to see whose. Lan just stood there, which meant, of course, they looked like a leopard ready to pounce. They're Black Aja, Nynaeve said at last. Her voice started faint and gained strength as she went on. Valian Boda and Ispan Shafar. They committed murder in the tower, and worse since. They're dark friends and... Her voice faltered for an instant. They have shielded me. The newcomers continued to advance serenely. Have you ever heard such nonsense, Ispan? The long-faced Aes Sedai asked her companion, who stopped grimacing at the dust long enough to smirk at Nynaeve. Ispan and I come from the White Tower, while Nynaeve and her friends are rebels against the Amarlan seat. They'll be punished severely for that, and so will anyone who helps them. With a shock, Matt realized the woman did not know. She thought that he and Lan and the others were just hired strong-arms. Valian directed a smile at Nynaeve. It made a blizzard warm by comparison. There's someone who will be overjoyed to see you when we take you back, Nynaeve. She thinks you are dead. Better the rest of you go now. You don't want to meddle in Aes Sedai affairs. My men will see you to the river. Without taking her eyes from Nynaeve, Phalion motioned for the men behind her to come forward. Lan moved. He did not draw his sword, and against Aes Sedai, he should have had no chance if he had. No chance in any case. But one moment he was standing still, and the next he had thrown himself at the pair. Just before he struck, he grunted as though hit hard, but he crashed into them, carrying both Black Sisters to the dusty floor. That opened the sluice gates wide. Lan pushed himself to hands and knees, shaking his head groggily, and one of the bulky fellows raised an iron-strapped club to smash his skull. Mat stabbed the fellow in the belly with his spear, as Beslan and Elysian and the 5 Red Arms rushed to meet the Dark Friend's shouting charge. Lan staggered to his feet, sword sweeping out to open a Dark Friend from crotch to neck. There was not much room to work sword or Ashendare in the corridor, but the tight quarters were what allowed them to face odds of 2 to 1 or worse without being overcome in the first moment. Grunting men struggled with them face to face, elbowing each other for room to stab or swing a club at them. Small spaces remained clear around the Black Sisters and around Nynaeve. They saw to that themselves. A wiry Andran Red Arm almost bumped into Phalion, but at the last instant, he jerked into the air and flew across the hallway, knocking down 2 of the heavy-shouldered Dark Friends in his flight before smacking into the wall and sliding down, the back of his head leaving a bloody smear on the cracked, dusty plaster. A bald-headed Dark Friend squeezed through the line of defenders and rushed at Nynaeve with outstretched knife. He yelled as his feet were suddenly jerked back from him, a yell that cut off when his face hit the floor so hard that his head bounced. Obviously, Nynaeve was no longer shielded, and if the chilly silver foxhead sliding around Mat's chest as he fought was not enough indication that she and the Black Sisters were in some sort of struggle, the way they glared at her and she at them, ignoring the battle around them, shouted the fact. The 2 wise women looked on in horror. They had their curved knives in their fists, but they huddled against the wall, staring from Nynaeve to the other 2 with eyes wide and mouths hanging open. "Fight!" Nynaeve snapped at them. She turned her head just a fraction, so she could see them as well as Phalion and Ispan. "I cannot do it alone. They're linked. If you don't fight them, they will kill you. You know about them now." The wise woman gaped at her, as though she had suggested spitting in the Queen's face. In the midst of shouts and grunts, Ispan laughed melodiously. In the midst of shouts and grunts, a shrill scream echoed down the stairs. Nynaeve's head swung that way. Suddenly she staggered, and her head swung back like a wounded badger's, with a scowl that should have made Phalion and Ispan leave right then if they had any sense. Nynaeve spared an agonized glance for Mat, though. "There was channeling upstairs," she said through her teeth. "There's trouble." Mat hesitated. More likely Elaine had seen a rat. More likely... He managed to knock aside a dagger thrust at his ribs, but there was no room to stab back with the Ashendare or use the haft like a quarterstaff. Beslan stabbed past him and took his attacker through the heart. "Please, Mat," Nynaeve said tightly. She never begged. She would cut her own throat first. "Please." With a curse, Mat pulled himself out of the fight and dashed up the steep, narrow stairs, taking all 6 flights in the dark stairwell at a dead run. There was not a single window to give light. If it was just a rat, he was going to shake Elaine till her teeth. He burst out onto the top floor, not much brighter than the stairwell, with only 1 window at the street end, burst into a scene from Nightmare. Women lay sprawled everywhere. Elaine was one, half on her back against the wall, eyes closed. Vannon crouched on his knees, blood streaming from nose and ears, feebly trying to pull himself up against the wall. The last woman on her feet, Janira, fled toward Mat as soon as she saw him. He had thought of her as a hawk, with her hooked beak of a nose and sharp cheekbones, but her face was pure terror now, those dark eyes wide and stark. "Help me!" she screamed at him, and a man caught her from behind. He was an ordinary-looking fellow, maybe a little older than Mat, of the same height and slender in a plain gray coat. Smiling, he took Janira's head between his hands and twisted sharply. The sound of her neck breaking was like a dry branch snapping. He let her drop in a boneless heap and gazed down at her. For a moment, his smile looked rapturous. By the light of a pair of lanterns, a small knot of men just beyond Vannon were prying open a door to the squeal of rusted hinges. But Matt hardly noticed. His eyes went from Janira's crumpled corpse to Elaine. He had promised to keep her safe for Rand. He had promised. With a cry, he launched himself at the killer, Ashendare extended. Matt had seen Myrddraal move, but this fellow was quicker, hard as that was to believe. He just seemed to flow from in front of the spear, and seizing a haft, he pivoted, flinging Matt past him 5 paces down the hall. Breath left when he hit the floor in a small cloud of dust. So did the Ashendare. Struggling for air, he pushed himself up, fox head dangling from his open shirt. Dragging a knife from under his coat, he flung himself at the man again, just as Nelisian appeared at the head of the stairs, sword in hand. Now they had him. However quick The man made a Myrddraal seem stiff. He slid around Nelisian's thrust as though there was not a bone in his body, right hand shooting out to seize Nelisian's throat. His hand came away with a liquid, ripping sound. Blood fountained past Nelisian's beard. His sword dropped, ringing on the dusty stone floor, and he clutched both hands to his ruined neck, red running through his fingers as he fell. Matt crashed into the killer's back, and they all 3 hit the floor together. He had no compunctions about stabbing a man in the back when it was necessary, especially a man who could tear somebody's throat out. He should have let Nelisian stay in bed. The thought came sadly as he drove the blade home hard, then a second time, a third. The man twisted in his grip. It should not have been possible, but somehow the fellow rolled over beneath him, pulling the knife hilt out of his hand. Nelisian's staring eyes and bloody throat were a reminder right before his eyes. Desperately, he grabbed the man's wrists, one hand slipping a little in the blood that ran down the fellow's hand. The man smiled at him. With a knife sticking out of his side, he smiled. "He wants you dead as much as he wants her," he said softly. And as if Matt was not holding him at all, his hands moved toward Matt's head, driving Matt's arms back. Matt pushed frantically, threw all of his weight against the fellow's arms to no avail. Light, he might as well have been a child fighting a grown man. The fellow was making a game of it, taking his bloody time. Hands touched his head.
Be right back, everyone.
Where was his flaming luck? He gave a heave with what seemed his last strength, and the medallion fell against the man's cheek. The man screamed. Smoke rose around the edges of the fox head, and a sizzle like bacon frying. Convulsively, he hurled Matt away with hands and feet both. This time, Matt flew 10 paces and slid. When he scrambled to his feet, half dazed, the man was already up, hands trembling at his face. A raw red brand marked where the fox head had fallen. Gingerly, Matt fingered the medallion. It was cool. Not the cool of someone channeling nearby. Maybe they were still at it below, but that was too far off. Just the cool of silver. He had no notion what this fellow was, except that he certainly was not human. But between that burn and 3 stab wounds, with the knife hilt still jutting out beneath his arm, he had to be slowed enough for Matt to get past him to the stairs. Avenging Elaine was all very well, and Nelisian too, but it was not going to happen today, apparently, and there was no call to supply a reason for avenging Matt Cawthon. Jerking the knife out of his side, the man hurled it at him. Matt snagged it out of the air without thinking. Tom had taught him to juggle, and Tom said he had the quickest hands he had ever seen. Flipping the knife around so he held it properly, point slanted up, he noticed the gleaming blade, and his heart sank. No blood. There should have at least been a smear of red, but the steel shone bright and clean. Maybe even 3 stab wounds was not going to slow this, whatever he was. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The other men were streaming out of that door they had pried open, the door those footprints had led him to yesterday, but their arms seemed full of rubbish, small half-rotted chests, a cask with cloth-wrapped objects bulging through missing staves, even a broken chair and a cracked mirror. They must have had orders to take everything. Paying no attention whatever to Matt, they hurried toward the far end of the hall and vanished around a corner. There had to be another set of stairs back there. Maybe he could follow them at a distance. Maybe... Just before the doorway they had come out of, Vannon made another effort to stand and fell back. Matt bit back a curse. Lugging Vannon was going to slow him, but if his luck was in... It had not saved Elaine, but maybe... From the corner of his eye, he saw her move, lifting a hand to her head. The man in the gray coat saw it too. With a smile, he He turned toward her. Sighing, Matt tucked the useless knife into its scabbard. "You can't have her," he said loudly. "Promises." One jerk broke the leather cord around his neck. The silver fox head dangled a foot below his fist. It made a low hum as he whirled it in a double loop. "You can't bloody have her!" He started forward, keeping the medallion spinning. The first step was the hardest, but he had a promise to keep. The fellow's smile faded. Watching the flashing fox head warily, he backed away on his toes. The same light that glittered on the whirling silver from the single window made a halo around him. If Matt could drive him that far, maybe he could see whether a 6th-story drop would do what a knife could not. Brand livid on his face, the fellow backed away, sometimes half-reaching as if to try grabbing past the medallion. And suddenly, he darted to one side, into one of the rooms. This one had a door that he pulled shut behind him. Matt heard the bar drop. Maybe he should have left it there, but without thinking, he raised a foot and slammed the heel of his boot against the center of the door. Dust leaped off the rough wood. A second kick, and rotten bar catches gave way, along with a rusted hinge. The door fell in, hanging at a slanted angle. The room was not entirely dark. A little light reached it from the window at the end of the hall, just one door away, and a broken triangle of mirror leaning against the far wall spread a faint illumination. That mirror let him see everything without going in. Aside from that and a piece of a chair, there was nothing else to see. The only openings were the doorway and a rat hole beside the mirror, but the man in the gray coat was gone. "Matt," Elaine called faintly. He hurried away from the room as much as toward her. There was shouting somewhere below, but Nynaeve and the rest would have to take care of themselves for the moment. Elaine was sitting up, working her jaw and wincing, when he knelt beside her. Dust covered her dress, her hat hung askew, some of the plumes broken, and her red-gold hair looked as if she had been dragged by it. "He hit me so hard," she said painfully. "I don't think anything is broken, but—" Her eyes latched onto his, and if he had ever thought she looked at him as if he were a stranger, he saw it for true now. "I saw what you did, Matt. With him. We might as well have been chickens in a box with a weasel. Channeling wouldn't touch him. The flows melted the way they do with your—" Glancing at the medallion still hanging from his fist, she drew a breath that did interesting things to that oval cutout. "Thank you, Matt. I apologize for everything I ever did or thought." She sounded as though she really meant it. "I keep building up tow toward you," she smiled ruefully. "But I am not going to let you beat me. You are going to have to let me save you at least once to balance matters." "I'll see what I can arrange," he said dryly, stuffing the medallion into a coat pocket. Tow? Beat her? Light. The woman was definitely spending too much time with Avienda. Once he helped her to her feet, she looked at the hallway, at Bannon with his blood-smeared face, and the women lying where they had fallen, and she grimaced. "Oh, light," she breathed. "Oh, blood and bloody flaming ashes." Despite the situation, he gave a start. It was not just that he had never expected to hear those words out of her mouth. They seemed peculiar, as if she knew the sounds but not the meanings. Somehow, they made her sound younger than she looked. Shaking off his arm, she discarded her hat, just tossing it aside, and hurried to kneel beside the nearest wise woman, Rihanna, and take her head in both hands. The woman lay limp, face down, and arms stretched out as though she had been tripped up running. Toward the room everyone had been after, toward her attacker, not away. "This one is beyond me," Elaine muttered. "Where is Nynaeve? Why didn't she come up with you, Matt? Nynaeve!" she shouted toward the stairs. "No need to shriek like a cat," Nynaeve growled, appearing in the stairwell. She was looking back over her shoulder down the stairs, though. "You hold her tight, you hear me?" she shrieked like a cat. She carried her hat and shook it at whoever she was shouting at. "You let her get away, too, and I'll box your ears till you hear bells next year." She turned then, and her eyes nearly bulged out of her head. "The lights shine on us," she breathed, hurrying to bend over Janira. One touch, and she straightened, wincing painfully. He could have told her the woman was dead. Nynaeve seemed to take death personally. Giving herself a shake, she went on to the next. To Marla, and this time it appeared that there was something she could heal. It also appeared Tamara's injuries were not simple because she knelt over her, frowning. "What happened here, Matt?" she demanded without looking around at him. Her tone made him sigh. He might have known she would decide it was his fault. "Well, Matt, what happened? Will you speak up, man, or do I have to—" He never learned what threat she intended to offer. Lan had followed Nynaeve out of the stairwell, of course, with Sumeko right at his heels. The stout wise woman took one look at the hall and immediately lifted her skirts and ran to Rihanna. She did give Elaine one worried glance before lowering herself to her knees and beginning to move her hands over Rihanna in an odd way. That was what pulled Nynaeve up short. "What are you doing?" she said sharply. Not halting what she was doing to Tamarla, she spared the round-faced woman only short glances, but they were as piercing as her voice. "Where did you learn that?" Sumeko gave a start, but her hands did not stop. "Forgive me, Aes Sedai," she said in a breathless, disjointed rush. "I know I'm not supposed to. She'll die if I don't. I know I wasn't supposed to keep trying to. I just wanted to learn, Aes Sedai. Please." No, go on," Nynaeve said absently. Most of her attention was fixed on the woman under her hands, but not all. "You seem to know a few things even I... That is to say, you have a very interesting way with the flows. I suspect you'll find that a great many sisters want to learn from you." Half under her breath, she added, "Maybe now they'll leave me alone." Sumeko could not have heard that last, but what she did hear dropped her chin to her considerable chest. Her hands barely paused, though. "Elaine," Nynaeve went on, "would you look for the bowl, please? I suspect that door is the one." She nodded to the correct door, standing open like half a dozen others. That made Matt blink until he saw 2 tiny cloth-wrapped bundles lying in front of it where the looters must have dropped them. "Yes," Elaine muttered. "Yes, I can do that much at least." Half raising her hand toward Vannon, still on his knees, she let it fall with a sigh and strode through the doorway, which almost immediately emitted a cloud of dust and the sound of coughing. The more than plump wise woman had not been the only one following Nynaeve and Lan. Iaina stalked out of the stairwell, forcing the Terrab on her dark friend in front of her by means of an arm twisted up into her back and a fist clutching the back of her neck. Iaina's jaw was set, her mouth tight. Her face was half frightened certainty that she would be skinned alive for manhandling an Aes Sedai, and half determination to hold on no matter what. Nynaeve had that effect on people sometimes. The Black Sister was wide-eyed with terror, sagging so she surely would have fallen except for Iaina's grip. She must have been shielded, certainly, and with equal surety, she probably would have chosen being skinned to whatever was going to happen to her. Tears began leaking from her eyes, and her mouth sagged in silent sobs. Behind them came Beslin, who gave a sad sigh at the sight of Nelisian, and a sadder for the women, and then Harnan and 3 of the Red Arms, Fergan, Gordoran, and Metwin. 3 who had been at the front of the building. Harnan and 2 of the others had bloody gashes in their coats, but Nynaeve must have healed them below. They did not move as if they still had injuries. They looked very subdued, though. "What happened at the back?" Matt asked quietly. "Burn me if I know," Harnan replied. "We walked right into a knot of shoulder thumpers with knives in the dark. There was one, moved like a snake." He shrugged, touching the blood-stained hole in his coat absent-mindedly. "One of them got a knife into me, and the next I remember is opening my eyes with Nynaeve Sedai bending over me, and Mendare and the others dead as yesterday's mutton." Matt nodded. "One who moved like a snake, and got out of rooms like one, too." He looked around the hallway. Brianna and Tamarla were on their feet, straightening their dresses, of course, and Vannon peering into the room where Elaine was apparently trying out some more curses, seemingly with no more success than earlier. It was hard to tell because of the coughing. Nynaeve stood, helping up Sibella, a scrawny yellow-haired woman, and Sumeko was still working on Femela, with her pale honey hair and big brown eyes. But he was never going to admire Melora's bosom again. Rihanna knelt to straighten her limbs and close her eyes, while Tamara performed the same service for Janira. 2 wise women dead, and 6 of his red arms. Killed by a man the power would not touch. "I found it!" Elaine shouted excitedly. She strode back out into the hall, holding a wide, round bundle of rotted cloth she would not let Vannon take from her. Coated in gray from head to toe, she looked as if she had lain down and rolled in the dust. "We have the Bowl of the Winds, Nynaeve." "In that case," Matt announced, "we are bloody well getting out of here now." Nobody argued. Oh, Nynaeve and Elaine insisted on all the men making sacks out of their jackets for things they rooted out of the room. They even loaded the wise women down, and themselves. And Rihanna had to go down and recruit men to carry their dead down the boat landing. But nobody argued. He doubted if the Rahat had ever seen as odd a procession as made its way to the river, or one that moved more quickly. Chapter 39. Promises to Keep. "We are bloody well getting out of here now," Matt said again later, and this time there was argument. There had been argument for the past half hour, near enough. Outside, the sun was past its noon peak. The trade winds cut the heat a little. Stiff yellow curtains fastened over the tall windows bulged and snapped at gusts. 3 hours back in the Tarasan Palace, the dice still bouncing in his head, and he wanted to kick something, or somebody. He tugged at the scarf tied around his neck. It felt as though the rope that had given him the scar under that scarf was back and tightening slowly. "Love of the light, are you all blind? Or just deaf?" The room Tylen had provided was large, with green walls and high blue ceiling, and no furnishings but gilded chairs and small tables set with pearl shell, yet it was crowded even so. It seemed so anyway. Tylen herself sat before one of the 3 marble fireplaces with her knees crossed, watching him with those dark eagle's eyes and a small smile, idly kicking her layered blue and yellow petticoats, idly toying with the jeweled hilt of her curved knife. He suspected Elaine or Nynaeve had spoken to her. They were there too, seated to either side of the Queen, somehow in clean dresses and apparently even bathed, though they had only been out of his sight for minutes at a stretch since returning to the palace. They almost matched Tylen for regal dignity in their bright silks. He was not sure who they wanted to impress with all that lace and elaborate embroidery. They looked ready for a royal ball, not a journey. He himself was still in his muck, with his dusty green coat hanging open, and the silver fox head caught in the neck of his half-undone shirt. Knotting the leather cord had shortened it, but he wanted the medallion touching his skin. He was around women who could channel, after all. Truth, those 3 women could probably have crowded the room by themselves. Tylen could have done it by herself, so far as he was concerned. If Nynaeve or Elaine had spoken to her, it was a very good thing that he was going. They 3 could have done it alone, but... "This is preposterous," Marililla announced. "I've never heard of any Shadowspawn called a golem. Have any of you?" That was directed to Adelius and Vandine, Saritha and Karyana. Facing Tylen, the cool-eyed Aes Sedai serenity of all 5 made a fair job of turning their high-backed armchairs into thrones. He could not understand why Nynaeve and Elaine just sat like lumps, coolly serene too, but absolutely silent. They knew, they understood, and for some reason Marililla and that lot slathered their tongues with meekness for them now. Matt Cawthon, on the other hand, was a hairy-eared lout who needed to be kicked, and from Marililla on down, they were all ready to do the kicking. "I saw the thing," he snapped. "Elaine saw the thing. Rihanna and the wise women saw it. Ask any of them." Gathered at the end of the room, Rihanna and the 5 surviving wise women shrank back like huddling hens, afraid of actual questions. All but Sumeko, anyway. Thumbs tucked behind her long red belt, the round woman kept frowning at the Aes Sedai, then shaking her head, frowning, and shaking her head. Nynaeve had had a considerable talk with her in the privacy of the cabin on the boat coming back, and Matt thought that had something to do with her newfound attitude. He had caught mention of Aes Sedai more than once, not that he had been trying to eavesdrop. The rest seemed to be wondering whether they should offer to fetch tea. Only Sameko had even appeared to consider the offer of a chair. Sabella, flapping bony arms in shock, had nearly fainted. "No one denies the word of Elaine Aes Sedai, Master Cawthon," said Ranila Din Kalon Bluestar in a cool, deep voice. Even had the dignified woman in silks to match the red and yellow floor tiles not been named to him earlier, the old memories meshed into his own would have identified her as windfinder to the mistress of the ships by the 10 fat gold rings in her earlobes, those in each ear connected by a golden chain and half hidden by the narrow wings of white in her straight black hair. The medallions clustered along the finer chain that ran to her nose ring would tell him what clan she came from, among other things. So would the tattoos on her slim dark hands. "What we question is the danger," she continued. "We do not like leaving the water without good cause." Nearly 20 seafolk women stood gathered behind her chair, a riot of colorful silks and earrings and medallions on chains for the most part. The first odd thing he had noticed about them was their attitude toward the Aes Sedai. They were perfectly respectful, on the surface at any rate, but he had never before seen anyone look at Aes Sedai smugly. The second odd thing came from those other men's memories. He did not know a great deal about the seafolk from them, but enough. Every Atha Anmier, man or woman, began as the lowest deckhand, whether they were destined one day to become the master of the blades or the mistress of the ships herself. And every step of the way between, the seafolk were sticklers for rank, to make any king or Aes Sedai look a sloven. The women behind Ranila were a peculiar lot by any measure. Windfinders to wave mistresses rubbing shoulders with windfinders from sorors by their medallions, but 2 wore bright blouses of plain wool above the dark oily breeches of deckhands, each with a single thin ring in her left ear. A second and third ring in the right indicated they were being trained as windfinders, but with 2 more to earn, not to mention the nose ring, it would be a long while yet that either would find herself called to haul sail whenever the deckmaster needed her, and find the deckmaster's flail across her rump if she did not move quickly enough. Those 2 did not belong in this gathering by any memory he had. Normally, the windfinder to the mistress of ships would not even have spoken to one of them. "Very much as I said, Ranila," Marililla said, icily condescending. She had certainly noticed those smug glances. That tone did not change as she shifted her attention to him. "Do not grow petulant, Master Cawthon. We are willing to listen to reason, if you have any." Matt gathered patience. He hoped he could find enough. Maybe if he used both hands and both feet. "Golem were created in the middle of the War of the Power, during the Age of Legends," he began from the beginning. Almost from the beginning of what Brigida had told him. He turned, facing each group of women as he spoke, burning if he was going to let one bunch think they were more important, or that he was bloody pleading with them, especially since he was. "They were made to assassinate Aes Sedai. No other reason. To kill people who could channel. The one power won't help you. The power won't touch a golem. In fact, they can sense the ability to channel if they're within, say, 50 paces of you. They can feel the power in you, too. You won't know the golem until it's too late. They look just like anybody else. On the outside. Inside, golem have no bones. They can squeeze themselves under a door. And they're strong enough to rip a door off steel hinges with one hand. Or rip out a throat. Light, he should have let Nelisian stay in bed. Suppressing a shiver, he pressed on. The women, all of them, watched him, almost not appearing to blink. He would not let them see him shiver. There were only 6 golem made, 3 male and 3 female. At least, that's what they look like. Apparently, even the Forsaken were a little uneasy about them, or maybe they just decided 6 was enough. Either way, we know one is in Abu Dar, probably kept alive since the breaking, in a stasis box. We don't know if any others were put into that box, but one is more than enough. Whoever sent him, and it had to be one of the Forsaken, knew to follow us across the river. He had to have been sent after the Bowl of the Winds, and by what he said to me, to kill Nynaeve or Elaine, maybe both. He spared them a quick look, soothing and sympathetic. Nobody could feel easy knowing that thing was after them. In return, he received a puzzled frown from Elaine, just the smallest wrinkling of her forehead, and from Nynaeve a slight wave of the hand, an impatient wave, to get on with it. To continue, he said, shooting the pair of them a glare. It was very hard not to sigh, dealing with women. Whoever sent the golem has to know the bowl is here in the Tarasin Palace now. If he or she sends the golem here, some of you are going to die. Maybe a lot of you. I can't protect all of you at once. Maybe he'll get the bowl, too. And that's on top of Feli and Boda. Small chance she's alone, even with Ispan a prisoner, so that means we have the Black Adja to worry about as well. Just in case the Forsaken and the golem aren't enough for you. Rihanna and the wise women drew themselves up even more indignantly than Marililla and her friends at the mention of the Black Adja, and the Aes Sedai, stiffening and gathering skirts, looked ready to stalk out in a huff. Press on, that was all he could do. Now do you see why you all have to leave the palace and take the bowl somewhere the golem doesn't know about? Somewhere the Black Adja doesn't know? Do you see why it has to be done now? Renila's sniff would have startled geese in the next room. You merely repeat yourself, Master Cawthon. Marililla Sedai says she has never heard of this golem. Elaine Sedai says there was a strange man, a creature, but little else. What is this stasis box? You have not explained that. How do you know what you claim to know? Why should we go any further from the water than we are, on the word of a man who creates fables from air? Matt looked to Nynaeve and Elaine, though with little hope. If they would only open their mouths, this could have been finished long since, but they gazed back at him, practicing expressionless Aes Sedai masks, till their jaws must be creaking. He could not understand their silence. A bare-bones account of events in the Rahad had been all they gave, and he was willing to bet they would not have mentioned the Black Adja at all had there been any other way to explain showing up in the palace with an Aes Sedai bound and shielded. Ispan was being held in another part of the palace, her presence known only to a handful. Nynaeve had forced some concoction down her throat, a foul-smelling mix of herbs that bulged the woman's eyes going down and had her giggling and stumbling in short order, and the rest of the knitting circle occupied the room with her for guards. Unwilling guards, but very assiduous. Nynaeve had made it extremely clear that should they let Ispan get away, they had best start running before she laid hands on them again. He very carefully did not look toward Brigitte, standing beside the door with Avienda. The Aiel woman wore an Ebudari dress, not the plain wool she had returned in, but a silver-gray silk riding dress that jarred with her plain-sheathed, horn-handled belt knife. Brigitte had been quick to shed her own dress for her usual short coat and wide trousers, these dark blue and dark green. A quiver already hung at her hip. She was the source of everything he knew about Golem, and stasis boxes, except what his eyes had seen in the Rahad, and he would not have revealed that on a hot grill. I read a book once that talked about, he began, and Renilah cut him off. A book, she sneered. I will not abandon the salt for a book Aes Sedai do not know. Suddenly it struck Matt that he was the only man present. Lan had gone off at Nynaeve's command, gone as tamely as Veslin had at his mother's.
Cheers, Chris.
Tom and Julian were packing to leave, had probably finished packing by now. If there was any use to it, if they ever did leave. The only man, surrounded by a wall of women who apparently intended to let him beat his head against that wall till his brains were scrambled. It made no sense. None. They looked at him, waiting. Nynaeve, in yellow-slashed, lace-trimmed blue, had pulled her braid over her shoulder so it hung down between her breasts. But that heavy gold ring, Lan's ring, he had learned, was carefully positioned to show anyway. Her face was smooth, and her hands rested in her lap, yet sometimes her fingers twitched. Elaine, in green Ebudari silk that made Nynaeve seem covered up despite the smoky lace collar under her chin, gazed back at him with eyes like cool pools of deep blue water. Her hands lay in her lap too, but now and again she would begin to trace the thread of gold embroidery that covered her skirts, then immediately stop. Why did they not say something? Were they trying to get back at him? Was it just a case of Matt wants to be in charge so much, let him see how well he can do without us? He might have believed it of Nynaeve, any time but this anyway, but not of Elaine. Not anymore. So why? Rihanna and the wise women did not huddle away from him as they did from the Aes Sedai, but their manner toward him had changed. Tamarla gave him a decently respectful nod. Honey-haired Femella went so far as a friendly smile. Strangely, Rihanna blushed, a pale stain. But they did not count as opposition, really. The 6 women had not said a dozen unprompted words between them since entering this room. Everyone would jump if Nynaeve or Elaine snapped her fingers, and keep jumping until told to stop. He turned to the rest of the Aes Sedai. Faces infinitely calm, infinitely patient. Except... Marilla's eyes flickered past him toward Nynaeve and Elaine for one instant. Saritha began slowly smoothing her skirts under his gaze, seemingly unaware of doing so. A dark suspicion bloomed in his mind. Hands moving on skirts, Rihanna's blush, Brigida's ready quiver. A murky suspicion. He did not really know of what, just that he had been going about this the wrong way. He gave Nynaeve a stern look and Elaine a sterner. Butter would not have melted on their bloody tongues. Slowly, he walked toward the sea folk. He just walked, but he heard someone with Marillella sniff, and Saritha muttered, "Such insolence." Well, he was about to show them insolence. If Nynaeve and Elaine did not like it, they should have taken him into their confidence. But he hated being used, especially when he did not know how or why. Stopping in front of R'naila's chair, he studied the dark faces of the Atha-Anmir women behind it before looking down to her. She frowned, stroking a knife set with moonstones thrust behind her sash. She was a handsome woman rather than pretty, somewhere in her middle years, and under different circumstances, he might have enjoyed looking at her eyes. They were large black pools a man could spend an evening just gazing into. Under different circumstances. Somehow the sea folk were the fly in the cream pitcher, and he had not a clue how to pluck it out. He managed to keep his irritation under control, barely. What to bloody do? "You can all channel, I understand," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean much to me. As well be straight from the start. You can ask Adelius or Vandine how much I care whether a woman can channel." R'naila looked past him toward Tylan, but it was not to the Queen she spoke. "Nynaeve Sedai," she said dryly, "I believe there was no mention in your bargain of my having to listen to this young oakum picker. I don't bloody care about your bargains with anybody else, you daughter of the sands," Matt snapped. So his irritation was not that well under control. A man could only take so much. Gasps rose among the women behind her. Something over 1,000 years ago, a sea folk woman had called an Assaninian soldier a son of the sands just before trying to plant a blade in his ribs. The memory lay tucked inside Matt Cawthon's head now. It was not the worst insult among the Atha-Anmir, but it came close. R'naila's face gorged with blood. Hissing, eyes bulging in fury, she leaped to her feet, that moonstone-studded dagger flashing in her fist. Matt snatched it out of her hand before the blade could reach his chest and shoved her back into her chair. He did have quick hands. He could still hold on to his temper, too. No matter how many women thought they could dance him for a puppet, he could... "You listen to me, you bilge stone." All right, maybe you could not hold it. Nynaeve and Elaine need you, or I'd leave you for the golem to crack your bones and the Black Ajah to pick over what's left. Well, as far as you're concerned, I'm the master of the blades, and my blades are bare. What that meant exactly, he had no idea, except for having once heard, "When the blades are bare, even the mistress of the ships bows to the master of the blades." This is the bargain between you and me. You go where Nynaeve and Elaine want, and in return, I won't tie the lot of you across horses like pack saddles and haul you there. That was no way to go on. Not with the Windfinder to the mistress of the ships. Not with a bilge boy off a broken-backed darter, for that matter. R'naila quivered with the effort of not going for him with her bare hands, and never mind her dagger in his hand. "It is agreed, under the light," she growled. Her eyes nearly started out of her head. Her mouth worked, confusion and disbelief suddenly chasing one another across her face. This time, the gasps sounded as if the wind had ripped the curtains down. "It is agreed," Matt said quickly, and touching fingers to his lips, he pressed them to hers. After a moment, she did the same, fingers trembling against his mouth. He held out the dagger, and she stared dully at it before taking it from him. The blade went back into its jeweled sheath. It was not polite to kill someone you had sealed a bargain with. At least, not until the terms were fulfilled.
Excuse me. All right, everyone, I'm gonna call into the stream for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.